Chapter 1500. 1,800 black cavalry, armed to the teeth, swarmed out like a black dragon and charged towards the capital of the Norman Khaganate. This scene caused the enemy cavalry to turn and flee. Even their general, Tuyabai, had his head chopped off in just 2 rounds. They did not think that they were that powerful. The cavalry of the Khaganate turned and fled, giving Beta Persei and the black cavalry an opportunity. They galloped their horses and followed the Mongol cavalry into the city. On the city gate tower, Saihanhin saw all of this with his eyes. When he saw the 5-star army charging into the city so easily, he angrily shouted, "Shoot the arrows! Shoot the arrows! Don't let them enter the city! Kill them and close the gates!" Saihanhin's reaction was very fast. The guards beside him were also very supportive. They took out their bows and shot down the city wall, trying to stop the black cavalry from advancing. In order to achieve their goal, some of the black cavalry soldiers who were close to the black cavalry also became their targets. Arrows rained down like rain. The Mongol cavalrymen, who were poorly equipped and defenseless, were shot by the arrows. All of them cried out in pain and fell from their horses. On the other hand, the black cavalry's armor was very good. The arrows did not have much effect on them. Kill anyone who approaches the city gate. Create the conditions for the rest of the army to enter the city. Yang was riding on his war horse. He waved his arms and cut down 3 Mongol cavalrymen who charged at him. Then he shouted at the other black knights and dragon guards. With Beta Persei's order, a group of 100 black cavalry soldiers immediately arrived in front of the city gate. They formed a tight formation and faced the Mongol cavalry, who came to attack the city gate. Crossbows appeared in the hands of the black cavalry soldiers. This kind of crossbow, which had great lethality at close range, was very suitable to deal with the current situation. With someone guarding the city gate, Beta Persei led the other black cavalry soldiers into the city. He wanted to find out where the palace was, but he did not expect to hear someone shouting for the Khan to leave quickly. Following Yang Chendong would give him a chance to learn. Although Beta Persei had a headache whenever he talked about learning and even wanted to sleep, he could still understand some simple Mongolian words by staying by Yang Chendong's side every day. It was because he heard this voice that Beta Persei looked over and saw many people escorting a person down the city wall. Looking at the other party's clothes, he could tell that he was either rich or noble. "Hey, where are you going?" Beta Persei was not sure of the other party's true identity. He felt that it should not be simple, so he turned his horse around and rushed over with the celestial armament sword in hand. Immediately, everyone threw down their weapons and surrendered, squatting on the ground. When Barry and Yuchuo led the army into the city, they saw the scene of the entire city kneeling on the ground. This result shocked the 2 division commanders. When they looked at Beta Persei, their eyes were full of worship. With just 1,800 cavalrymen, not only did they charge into the city and capture the Khan, they also made the 10,000 cavalrymen surrender and kneel on the ground. If it didn't happen in front of their eyes, they wouldn't believe it even if someone else told them. On the contrary, Beta Persei, who was worshipped, was not surprised at all. Leading the most elite black cavalry of the 5-star army, he would not be surprised at anything. "Okay, immediately seal off the entire city. Don't spread the news here. Check the captured goods, especially the food, and be ready to attack again." Taking down the Norman Khanate was naturally not Beta Persei's ultimate goal. In his eyes, the real boss was the great Khan of the Timur Empire, Amur. As long as he captured him, the mission would be considered complete. Come, immediately report this matter to the young master. At the same time, inform him of our plan. Plan? Is it about the surprise attack on the Timur Empire? Captain Chauvet, who was following beside him, asked excitedly. That's right. Beta Persei nodded, and then his eyes were filled with excitement. If this matter could really be accomplished, then there was no doubt that this time he would be able to show his face. It would also be enough to prove that he was a real, valiant general and not just a subordinate of the young master. In the main tent, the telegram was quickly sent to Yang Qindong. Director Wang Shan, who was in charge of delivering the telegram, also said excitedly, "Sixth young master, look, Brother Beta Persei has made a meritorious service again." Haha, that's right. His surprise attack was indeed very unexpected. It's just that. Yang Qindong did not say what it was. However, Wang Shan could sense that Yang Qindong was worried about whether or not he would be able to launch a surprise attack on the Timur Empire. Yang Qindong was indeed a little worried. After all, although the Norman Khanate had the name of a country, it was actually just a small tribe. The total army of the whole country was less than 100,000 people. They had also sent a large number of troops to support the eastern and main lines, so they basically did not have many troops in the capital. However, the Timur Empire was completely different. Their influence was so great that it was not inferior to the Golden Horde. Their capital, Herat, located in the northwest of Afghanistan, was heavily guarded. It was not a place that could be taken down easily. If things were not handled well, they might fall into a siege, which would be very dangerous. Chapter 15:01. Under the barrage of muskets, not a single cavalryman was able to get within 300 steps of the trenches. The battle lasted from day to night. In the end, the Khaganate army left behind about 12,000 corpses before retreating helplessly. On the other hand, the Cold Front army didn't suffer a single casualty. In fact, the marksmanship of the soldiers was even better. It was said that sharpshooters were trained by bullets, but that was only true for fixed targets. Occasionally, there would be moving targets. For example, a real target like this was something that even the sharpshooters of the future envied. In order to train the soldiers' marksmanship and take into account that the enemy's charge wasn't too loud, Commander Xiaofeng conducted actual combat training in units of battalions. Not only did this save bullets to a certain extent, it also preserved the soldiers' stamina to the greatest extent. They were surrounded on all sides and had only sent out 4 battalions of soldiers. In this kind of battlefield, they would have no problem holding out for a long time. Not to mention, before they were surrounded, they had brought 20 days' worth of rations. Unlike the Mongolian army, they had instant noodles, biscuits, ham sausages, canned food, and so on. Even if they didn't have a chance to start a fire, they could still eat until they were full. This was the best way to preserve their stamina and fighting spirit. Seeing that Cold Front's 2nd Regiment had killed more enemies than their entire regiment, the 1st Regiment's commander Min Fu and the 2nd Regiment's commander Lori were envious. They came up to Xiaofeng and asked sincerely, "General Xiao, our commander has sent a telegram saying that he's on his way with the army, but we don't know when we'll launch our counterattack." "There's no rush." Xiaofeng, who carried the rank of Major General, smiled and shook his head. It was rare to have an opportunity like this to train the soldiers. He wanted to let the soldiers of the division go through a sieve. This would be a great help in increasing the fighting strength of the division. Although they were all division commanders, the Cold Front Division's commander had the rank of Major General. Only they and the commander of the world's #1 cavalry army could enjoy this kind of treatment. This was enough to prove the strength of the two armies. On the other hand, the other division commanders were at most senior colonels. In comparison, the difference in status between the two sides was obvious. Even though Major General Xiaofeng said this, Min Fu and Lorui, who were also division commanders but only had the rank of 2 bars and 4 bars, couldn't say anything. When it was almost daybreak, the two division commanders were suddenly called into the tent by Xiao Feng. Through their narration, the decision made last night was changed. Commander Min, Commander Luo, please get ready. Let the soldiers eat in advance and prepare for the counterattack. The reason why the situation changed so quickly was naturally not only because the Third Corps commander Wu Sheng had already brought the main force of the army to the periphery of the battlefield, ready to provide support at any time. The main reason was that Yang Qindong had sent a telegram. No one in the Five-Star Army had the right to question or be dissatisfied with Yang Qindong's orders. This was a kind of respect, a kind of prestige accumulated over a long period of battle. There was another mission for him, to finish the battle as quickly as possible. As soon as the telegram was delivered, Xiao Feng knew what to do next. He then called for Min Fu and the other two teachers to discuss the matter of counterattacking. The three division commanders sat together. The candlelight in the tent was lit for half an hour until the messenger came to report that the soldiers had already eaten breakfast and could attack at any time. The three division commanders looked at each other and nodded heavily. After telling each other to pay attention to safety, they walked out of the tent. Outside the encirclement, Harsan Han's face was a bit ugly. He only went asleep at midnight, but even so, he still tossed and turned in bed for nearly an hour before falling asleep. It wasn't strange for him to have such a performance. He thought that he had the upper hand, but after attacking for a day, not only did he lose 15% of his strength, he didn't even hurt a single hair on the enemy's head. This was the first time he had encountered such a battle in his life. Even when facing the Five-Star Army in the east, although they were defeated time and time again, they were still able to injure some of the enemy. It wasn't like this time. They were clearly the attacking side, but they could only passively take a beating. He found a few of his subordinates to discuss until midnight, but they still couldn't come up with a better plan. Everyone finally decided to observe carefully the next day to see if they could find a direction to attack. Only then did they go to sleep. At this time, the sky was beginning to brighten. But even so, Harsan Han still didn't have the intention to get up. He didn't sleep well last night, so he wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to sleep a little longer to ensure that he had enough energy to deal with various matters during the day. Whoosh, boom. Harsan Han, who did not want to get out of bed, was about to lie down for a while. Suddenly, a sharp whistling sound rang out beside his ear. Following that, he felt the bedboard shake. The huge explosion caused him to be unable to sleep peacefully. What's going on? What's going on? The frightened Harsan Han got off the bed with his clothes in disarray. He rushed out of the tent and wanted to ask the guard outside what was going on outside. However, what he saw next made him unable to ask any more questions. He could see with his own eyes the cannonballs exploding within the camp, destroying one tent after another. One of the cannonballs was less than 40 steps away from his main tent. Standing in front of the main tent, he could even feel the shockwave from the explosion. In comparison, the surrounding Mongol soldiers weren't much better off. Some of them were directly hit by the cannonballs, and some of them were injured by the shrapnel. Although they didn't die immediately, they breathed out more than they breathed in. Of course, most of them were those who had suffered minor injuries. They were bleeding. The wounds were not big, and there was only a small piece of shrapnel embedded in their bodies. However, if the shrapnel was not taken out, the prolonged bleeding would eventually kill them. It could be said that there was no safe place to hide under the cannonballs. When the cannonballs landed on the Mongol camp, it was already a mess. The general didn't give any orders, and the soldiers didn't have the will to fight. Where did the cannonballs come from? Didn't you say that the cannonballs of the Five-Star Army weren't surrounded by us? Seeing the hellish scene in front of him, Harsan Han angrily asked, This. A few generals who had run to the main tent lowered their heads. Previously, because the cannonballs of the 2nd Cold Front Regiment were well hidden within the army, and because they didn't encounter any cannonballs yesterday, they were certain of this. But now, it seemed like they had been tricked. Harsin Han, who had vented his anger, knew that this wasn't the time to ask for responsibility. He said, "Go back to the army and think of a way to gather the troops. Be prepared for battle." This Khan is thinking that the cannonballs are just a prelude. Perhaps their real counterattack is coming. Counterattack? They only have 30,000 men, and we have 80,000. Will they counterattack? This sentence attracted the suspicion of the generals. Even at this time, his subordinates still doubted his words. This made Harsin Han very angry. He knew that it was because of his usual actions that his subordinates didn't trust him. If he wanted them to listen to him, he had to negotiate with them. As such, he had to change his tone and explain patiently. It was because of this explanation that the Mongol army lost the most crucial time. As the saying goes, speed is the most important thing in war. Sometimes every minute and second on the battlefield was the key to victory. While Harsin Han was explaining to his subordinates, the first round of cannonballs of the 5-star army had ended. Following that, the cavalry began their charge. The 20,000 cavalry of the 2 mixed cavalry divisions had long been envious of the achievements of the 5-star army. Now, it was finally their turn to perform. One by one, they galloped forward on their horses and shouted loudly. They also wanted to make a name for themselves. "Great Khan, the 5-star army has indeed launched a counterattack." A young scout rode up to Harsin Han and reported the situation in a loud voice. Facts spoke louder than words. Harsin Han had said a lot earlier, but the generals didn't believe him. However, the facts had slapped them in the face. When the generals looked at Harsin Han, they all revealed looks of admiration. This time, there was no need to say anything. The generals dispersed and began to gather their troops. The Mongol soldiers also had a certain amount of battle experience. When they saw the 5-star Legion Corps charging over, even without the command of their general, many of them were already prepared to charge. They turned their horses around and mounted their horses. They were prepared to engage in a bloody battle with the 5-star army at any time. "Commander, the Mongol army's attention is on the interior. This is the time for us to charge." The 3rd Corps Nuzan Cavalry Division's commander, Yella, had already moved to the periphery of the Mongol army. At this time, he stood beside Wu Sheng and asked for instructions. "Good, give the order. All troops attack." Wu Sheng, who couldn't wait any longer, how could he not want to make a name for himself? Previously, under the pincer attack of the Golden Horde and the Ross dukedom, they could only barely hold their ground. Now that they finally had a chance to make a name for themselves, how could he give it up? With a loud shout, he led his 3 divisions and 30,000 soldiers to charge towards the Mongol army from different directions. At this time, the Mongol army's main focus was on the 5-star army that was surrounded. Although they had arranged for some troops to be stationed at the outer perimeter, it was to prevent the other 5-star Corps reinforcements from suddenly appearing and attacking them from both sides. However, with the chaos in the camp and the generals not returning in time, these soldiers had long forgotten about their previous mission. They only wanted to solve the problem in front of them. Now, there was no one to defend behind them. When Wu Sheng appeared with his army, they were caught off guard. Chapter 1502. On the battlefield, the slightest accident could cost a person's life. The enemy troops suddenly appeared behind them, and they were charging ferociously. At this moment, the Mongol army had no choice but to send out a portion of their forces to block them. At this moment, the second wave of cannon fire arrived, causing the Mongol army, who had just regained their order, to fall into chaos once more. The timing was really accurate, and it could be said to be perfect. The cannon fire disrupted the order of the Mongol army, and it also covered the shouts of the Mongol generals, causing them to be unable to gather their troops. In just 15 minutes, the 5-star army had formed a pincer attack. Facing such a situation, many of the Mongol soldiers were confused as to who they should fight, taking advantage of the fact that the enemy had not formed a defensive formation. Wu Sheng's 3rd Legion charged into the Mongol army like a sharp blade, and they started their massacre. The reason why cavalry was so terrifying and had dominated the battlefield for a whole decade and a century was precisely because they were fast enough, their charge was fierce enough, and their lethality and destructive power were shocking and terrifying. Once they lost these advantages, they were no different from ordinary infantry waiting to be slaughtered. Without impulse, there would be no speed. Without speed, they would not be able to display their strength. Without strength, there would be no killing power and no destructive power. They were just riding on horses, facing the soldiers of the 3rd Legion. In just one exchange, the Mongol army was cut down, and over 1,000 of them were injured. As the main force of the 3rd Legion continued to charge into the Mongol army, the number of casualties continued to increase. Block it, block it. Harsan Han also saw this shocking scene. When he saw the cavalrymen, he was proud of being killed off one by one without the slightest ability to resist. He cried out in pain. The various Khans were like a chaotic animal kingdom, and there was only one rule of survival, which was the survival of the fittest. Whoever had the biggest fist was the boss. And this was what the Mongol army, which did not have much culture, valued. The reason why he could still make his voice heard in the Khaganate alliance was because he had these cavalry units. This was the fundamental reason why no one could ignore his existence. But now, these cavalrymen that he regarded as his lifeblood couldn't even withstand a single blow from the 5-star army. They were harvested like chives, and it was as if his flesh was being cut off. It made him feel extremely miserable. We can't block them anymore, Khan. Let's break out. The captain brought a group of soldiers in front of Harsan Han and begged. On the battlefield, once defeat was apparent, it was not something that could be changed by a single person's decision. If it was said that Yang Qindong was still somewhat hesitant when Beta Persei suggested to attack the capital of the Timur Empire, Herat, then this victory gave him more confidence. He knew that the conditions of the battlefield had been formed, and it was time to complete the surprise attack. With the help of the 2nd Cold Front Division, the 3rd Star Army obtained a great victory over the Mongolian army, defeating 100,000 enemies. After this news was spread through the telegram, the commander of the 1st Star Army's 4th Division, Su Kuda, became anxious. Speaking of which, they had clashed with the enemy's main force earlier than anyone else. Moreover, they had also launched several attacks, but the results did not seem to be very good. Although from the results of the battle, they had always had the upper hand, but they did not achieve their goal of heavily injuring the enemy. We can't continue like this. Isn't the 1st Star Army less than 200 li away from here? Send a message to them to come and support us. Su Kuda finally decided to send other reinforcements. This was not because he was afraid of the enemy, but because he wanted to use more advantages to annihilate the enemy. Just from this point alone, he already had the qualities of an excellent commander. He no longer cared about the fruits of victory in front of him. He was willing to share the credit with other allies, which was equivalent to having a view of the overall situation. Su Kuda was also preparing for the final attack. In contrast, Commander Tian, who had already obtained the fruits of victory. Under his surprise attack, he had successfully captured the capital of the Ilkhanate, Tabuli Tuching. In order to achieve the goal of not letting the news leak out, the 4 divisions of the army attacked the 4 gates to ensure that no one could escape the city and spread the news. The world's #1 cavalry army was indeed worthy of being in existence, that was second only to the Black Cavalry in terms of cold weapons. From the moment they launched their attack to the moment they captured the entire Tabulae Tuching, they had only used less than 4 hours. Furthermore, they had achieved their goal of not letting a single enemy escape. After quietly capturing the city, Tian, who did not let the army take down the old flag of the Ilkhanate. On the surface, the city did not look any different from before. This was him fishing, waiting for the enemy to walk into the trap. Although Tian, who did not know who would appear here, his intuition and the pattern of the battle told him that there would definitely be enemies here. After 6 days, not a single enemy appeared. Instead, many Mongolian soldiers and civilians were executed because they were hostile to the 5-star army. Letting the world's #1 cavalry army do the work of a third-rate army was indeed a waste of talent. Some of the soldiers had their own opinions about this. Looking at the battlefield, the other Allied forces had already made contributions, but the world's #1 cavalry army had only chosen to wait, making them feel sullen. Regarding this, Tian, who used his aura to suppress it. However, at this moment, his heart wavered a little. If he only obtained this bit of merit in this battle, then he was somewhat unqualified to be a commander. Finally, on the morning of the 7th day, the scouts outside the city reported that they had seen a large number of Mongolian soldiers outside the city. At this time, they were moving in the direction of the city. Hearing that there was finally an enemy who had taken the bait, Tian, who immediately became spirited. The 5-star army soldiers in the city also changed from their previous dispirited state to full of vigor. At this time, about 5 li away from the city, a group of about 30,000 people was slowly making their way into the city. Leading them was the Ivan Khanate's Harsan Khan, as well as the 20,000 Kazakh Khanate cavalry led by Alateng. After the defeat, Harsan Khan had killed his way out of the encirclement under the protection of his personal guards. Following that, he gathered the remaining soldiers and gathered about 10,000 people. After that, he met the 20,000 Kazakh cavalry, who were coming to support him. Thus, he mixed them into one army and retreated to Tabulae Tuching. At the same time, he reorganized his army and looked for an opportunity to fight again. Harsan Khan did not admit defeat because he did not know what had happened on the other battlefields. He only thought that it was his own army that had lost. Then he still had 200,000 cavalry at his disposal. Moreover, as long as he could hold on, the other Khanates might continue to send reinforcements. Harsan Khan was not discouraged, as there was still hope to turn defeat into victory. Gathering the 20,000 Kazakh cavalry was the first step. The 30,000 cavalry, under the leadership of Harsan Khan, turned around and headed towards Tabulae Tuching. At this time, no one would have thought that their base was no longer under their control and had become a graveyard. After knowing the exact number of enemies, Tian, who knew that it was not realistic to want to destroy them in the city. Once the enemy found out that the commander guarding the city had changed, he was afraid that the first thing they would do was to escape. Thus, he had waited for 6 days in vain. This result was unacceptable to Tian, who, no matter what, he is still a general of the Kazakh Khanate and not a subordinate of Harsan Khan. Even if you have something to discuss, you should discuss it with him and not scold him like a dog. After being scolded, the anger in Dexi's heart was getting bigger and bigger. This time, when he came to the battlefield, he didn't have any opportunity to show off. He encountered Harsan Khan and was brought here. Then, he was inexplicably attacked. If it was anyone else, they would have already been incomparably depressed. This scolding made his heart even angrier, but he didn't have a suitable opportunity to vent. Enough. I am a general of the Kazakh Khaganate, not your Ilkhanate's general. At this moment, Dexy wanted to shout out his thoughts, but he didn't dare to do so. Among the Khaganates, Kazakh was the first to fight with the Five-Star Army. Because their geographical location was very close to the Ili region, they had invested a large number of troops early on. As a result, their losses were very serious. For example, Janilbek Khan's younger brother, Kelai, was captured by the Five-Star Army. Many of the country's generals were killed, and a second-rate general like Kelai was now in charge of military power. Dexy had some ability, otherwise he wouldn't be in charge of 20,000 soldiers. But his personality was too weak, and he was a bit timid. Because of this, his career had never been smooth. This time, he came to support the Ilkhanate because there were no generals in the Khaganate, which gave him the opportunity. If it was anyone else who was scolded like this by Harsinhan, they would have been furious and refuted. But Dexy didn't have such courage, and this naturally had a lot to do with his personality. But this didn't mean that he wasn't angry. When he left the Great Khan's tent and returned to his own tent, the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. When he heard how brave the Five-Star Army was, and how it was only a matter of time, he couldn't see the slightest future. It was also at this time that the guard captain Wan Yinhong proposed to him to surrender the Five-Star Army. This was because he understood Dexy. He knew that this person's personality was weak, and that he was indecisive when doing things. If it was any other general, the guard captain wouldn't dare to be so direct. And after he said this, Dexy didn't have any intention of blaming him. On the contrary, he was quite hesitant. "General, we can't wait any longer." The battle during the day was all because of the terrain. There wasn't enough open space, so the Five-Star Army couldn't display their abilities in a large-scale battle. This is why we were able to hold on for the day. Once we wait until tomorrow and face another fierce attack, I'm afraid we really won't be able to hold on. Guard Captain Wan Yinhong saw that Dexy didn't say anything and didn't make a decision, so he helped him analyze the situation of the battlefield. Being pressed hard by Wan Yinhong, Dexy replied, "But will the Five-Star Army accept our surrender? If they treat us like normal captives, then what's the point of surrendering and living a life worse than death?" Seeing that Dexy was wavering, Wan Yinhong hurriedly said, "General, there's no good way out if we surrender like this, but at least we can keep our lives, right? The current situation is that the Five-Star Army is too strong. This lowly one will say something disappointing. This time, not only will the Ilkhanate be finished, even our Kazakh Khanate won't be any better. If things go wrong, our Khanate will be destroyed. Right now, we won't get any benefits from selling our lives to those people. This can't be." Dexy raised his head, his face filled with fear and uneasiness. "How can it not be? Think about how strong the Golden Horde is, but in front of the Five-Star Army, won't it still be destroyed? Although our Khanates don't look weak, we're all fighting for ourselves. Under these conditions, how can we be a match for the Five-Star Army? Today, the Ilkhanate will be destroyed. Next time, it might be someone else. Actually, we can be considered lucky." Wan Yinhong sighed. "Lucky? What do you mean?" This made Dexy a bit confused. "General, think about it. We were the first batch to come into contact with the Five-Star Army. If we surrender now, we'll have more chances to gain merits. This lowly one heard that in the Five-Star Army there are many soldiers and generals from the Golden Horde. Some generals even lead large armies. It must be because the Five-Star Army is developing too quickly, and there aren't enough generals. But speaking of which, isn't this an opportunity for people like you? As long as you seize the opportunity, you can completely transform into a general of the Five-Star Army. That would be the best-case scenario. Becoming a general of the Five-Star Army. Is that possible?" Dexy shook his head, his face filled with disbelief. "What's impossible about it? Even if it's impossible, so what? Even the Khan's younger brother, Kelai, has been captured. Even if we surrender, it won't be a shameful matter. Not to mention, there's an opportunity to make a contribution right in front of us. As long as we can grab hold of it, who can say what the outcome will be? Wanyan Hong looked at Dashi with a hopeful expression. What opportunity to gain merits? Dexy clearly thought of something, but he still wanted to get confirmation from Wanyan Hong. It was because he understood his general too well that Wanyan Hong didn't hesitate to whisper, "Capture Harsan Khan. This is the opportunity for you to gain merits." No, the other party is the Khan of a Khanate. We can't do that. Dexy quickly shook his head and refused. He was used to being a subject. Now that he was suddenly asked to capture the Khan, it was no wonder he had such a big reaction. Wanyan Hong anxiously sighed in his heart. Harsan Khan has already ordered us to take the lead and launch a counterattack against the 5-star army tomorrow morning, and then kill a way out for them. General, there is no need to mention the strength of the 5-star army. What is the difference between doing this and committing suicide? Harsan Khan is not our Kazakh great Khan. There is no need for us to make such sacrifices for him. That's right. They don't even see us as humans. There is no need for us to work for them. General, please give the order. We will break out of the encirclement tonight. Even if we die, we will not serve Harsan Khan. The generals below all spoke one after another, expressing their strong dissatisfaction with Ili Khan Harsan Khan. When Dashi heard all of this, his face turned even redder. At this time, he had no time to distinguish whether this news was true or false. He thought of how Harsan Khan had cursed him during the day. He was already angry to begin with. He really wanted to ignore Harsan Khan and lead his troops to kill their way out. At that time, it would be lucky if they could charge out, but if they couldn't, then it would be his fate to die on the battlefield. However, his hesitant personality came into play at this time. Dashi still hesitated. He didn't want his soldiers to be wronged, but he also didn't want to become enemies with Harsan Khan. Therefore, he didn't know what to do. Looking at this time, Dashi still didn't make a final decision. Wanyan Hong, who was at the side, decided to press on and force him to make a decision. He stepped forward and said, "General, I can understand your feelings. As a subject, as a general, we should listen to the orders of the monarch. But the problem is that we are not people of the Ili Khanate. If the 5-star army didn't appear, then our 2 Khanates would have fought at any time. Is it worth it for us to protect such a person with our lives? Moreover, whether or not we can protect Harsan Khan's life is another matter. However, we brothers will definitely die here. Please take into account that we have all followed the general for so many years and give us a way out." A way out? Dashi once again remembered what Wanyan Hong had said to him at that time because of his many years of subordinate mentality. When he heard that he would do something unfavorable to the great Khan, he didn't even think about it and refused. If he really did that, then he would be a traitor to the entire Khanate alliance and would be punished by everyone. He quickly shook his head and said, No, although Harsan Khan isn't our great Khan, he is one of the great Khans recognized by the Khanate alliance. As subjects, we can't have such thoughts. Generals, please don't say any more. Tomorrow morning, I will find Harsan Khan and make him give up on the idea of sending troops to take the lead. Dashi's words were completely self-deceiving. With his personality, how could he argue in front of Harsan Khan? Obviously, he couldn't. This was just his words of comfort. It was because he didn't have the courage to make a choice and didn't have the courage to say no to his superiors that he had to lie to these Kiliarchs. This was a matter of the inheritance and education of the Khanate. In order for their rule to be passed down for 10,000 years or even longer, these great Khans had instilled in their generals, soldiers, and people the idea of loyalty to the great Khan. They let them know that the Great Khan was the chosen one, and they could decide all life and death. On the other hand, no one was allowed to have any thoughts about the Great Khan. Otherwise, it would be going against the will of the heavens, and everyone would have the right to punish them. It was this product of Dexy's education that made him want to protect the safety of the Great Khan even in the face of life and death. Even if the Great Khan was not from his own country, he was still very important in his eyes. All right, everyone disperse first. Harsan Khan said that he has already reported this matter to the outside. Soon, there will be reinforcements coming. As long as we can hold on until then, everyone will be fine. At that time, Harsan Khan will definitely reward us according to our contributions. Ha! Dashi wasn't stupid and knew how to use this method to unite the people. He gave everyone hope and drew a beautiful blueprint in front of them. This way, not only could he stabilize the people's hearts, but when the battle broke out, everyone would be able to use their full strength. However, this kind of ordinary method was destined to fail today. Who didn't know that because of the sudden appearance of the 5-star army, they didn't have time to send people to ask for reinforcements? So, where did this so-called reinforcements come from? They didn't know what happened here at all, okay? Seeing that Dashi still wanted to deceive them at this time, everyone's expression became unfriendly. Since this kind of persuasion didn't work, there was only one last method left. Thinking of this, everyone's gaze landed on the personal guard captain, Wang Yanhong. Of course, Wang Yanhong knew what everyone wanted to do. To be honest, this was the last step. If there was any other method, he wouldn't want to do it. However, Dashi was so stubborn and didn't listen to anyone's advice. Thus, he could only resort to something like a mutiny. What are you all trying to do? No matter what, Dashi was still a commander of 20,000 people. When the atmosphere in the tent suddenly changed, he had a premonition that things weren't going well. His expression couldn't help but reveal a trace of panic. "Sai, General, why do you have to do this? Since you're thinking of going up and not giving us a way out, then you can't blame us." Wang Yanhong finally spoke. The moment he spoke, the 7 Kiliarchs in the tent rushed up like ferocious beasts and pressed Dashi, who had already touched the curved blade, to the ground. Previously, Wang Yanhong was blocking in front. Now that this personal guard captain wasn't there to help, Dashi instantly became a prisoner. No matter what, he was still a personal guard captain and was responsible for the general's safety. Wang Yanhong didn't have any intention of harming Dashi. He decided to hand this person over to the 5-star army to deal with. His current mission was to bring people to take down Harsan Han, taking advantage of the fact that the other party didn't know what was going on and wasn't on guard. He quickly took him down. Only then could he appear before the 5-star army as a meritorious subject. At this moment, Harsan Han, who was 2 li away from the tent, didn't know about the mutiny below. At this moment, he had already entered the land of dreams and seemed to be having a bad dream. He had a conflicted expression on his face. It wasn't until Wang Yanhong brought people to place the curved blade on his neck that he woke up with a start. "Who are you people? What do you want?" When he woke up and saw a bunch of unfamiliar soldiers standing in front of him, Harsan Han instinctively wanted to shout. However, he immediately felt his vision turn black and was knocked out by a punch. The person who made the move was Wang Yanhong. He only knocked Harsan Han out because he didn't want to cause any more trouble. Now that the people who should be controlled were under control, he personally said to a Chiliarch beside him, "I'll leave the matters at home to you guys. I'm going to the 5-star army's main camp now. Captain Wanyan, are you going to go personally?" The Chiliarch was a little nervous. In his opinion, before he understood the 5-star army's attitude, there was no harm in sending someone else to communicate with them first. It was the best plan. "Yes, I'll go personally. If I send someone else, they won't be able to explain clearly. Wang Yanhong chuckled. Then he brought a healthy horse and galloped out of the main camp. Chapter 15:05. At midnight, the 5-star Army's camp was very quiet. Other than the soldiers on duty, the other soldiers and officers had already gone to bed early. There was still a tough battle waiting for them tomorrow. Without sufficient physical and mental strength, it would be impossible. However, in the main tent, Mu, and the other 3 division commanders were not sleeping. The 4 of them were glaring at each other, looking as though they had nowhere to vent their anger. The attack during the day wasn't very successful. Because the terrain was too narrow, the 5-star Army's few charges were limited by the terrain. They couldn't unleash their full potential. Not only that, they had nowhere to hide under the rain of arrows. As a result, nearly 1,000 soldiers died. Although less than 300 of them died in the battle, most of them were injured. Moreover, they could still return to the camp after treatment. However, to the world's #1 cavalry army, this was still a big blow. 40,000 against 30,000. They had the advantage in numbers and even launched a surprise attack. However, they didn't win the battle and even lost many soldiers. No matter how one looked at it, this was a humiliation. It was a slap to the faces of the 4 division commanders. The 4 division commanders, who were always chatty when they gathered together, fell into silence for the first time. They didn't even inform Tian, who of this news. Otherwise, who knew what kind of thunderous roar they would face. Every division commander would have to bear a punishment first. This time, it could be said that the 4 division commanders had disgraced the invincible and undefeatable #1 cavalry army. What made the 4 division commanders even angrier was that tomorrow's attack wouldn't be too smooth. They knew that there was no way to retreat. If the enemy fought with their backs to the wall, even if they won in the end, they would have to pay a heavy price. They had the advantage in numbers, but still had to pay a heavy price. This was something the 4 division commanders couldn't accept. Of course, it wasn't that there wasn't a better way. For example, they could surround the enemy and not attack after a long time. The enemy would have to surrender when they ran out of food and water. However, how much time would that take? Seeing that all the armies and divisions were seizing every second to gain merits on the battlefield, they had no choice but to surround the less than 30,000 enemies and wait here. This was not something that a powerful army like the #1 cavalry army in the world should do. Sigh, if only we had the Cold Vanguard Division to cooperate with us. 2nd Division Commander Lu Duo couldn't help but say. He saw the 4 division commanders sitting side by side. The moment he entered the tent, Wang Yanhong, who had been silent the entire time, immediately shouted, "What are you all doing? Is this the treatment for those who voluntarily surrender? If that's the case, then you can kill me." Wang Yanhong said preemptively. He wanted the teacher to snatch the person away. Only then would he be able to take the initiative in the following conversation. However, it was a pity that facing the 4 division commanders who had walked out of a mountain of blades and a sea of flames, their powerful auras still scared him, causing his body to tremble uncontrollably. All of this was clearly seen by the 4 division commanders. They knew that Wang Yanhong was trembling out of fear, but Gong Feng and the other 3 division commanders didn't take the initiative to expose him. This was because they were also very curious. What was Wang Yanhong doing here at this time? What did he mean by taking the initiative to surrender just now? Come, untie him and give him a seat. Gong Feng spoke on behalf of the 4 division commanders. The 2 guards weren't worried that Wang Yanhong would play any tricks. Which of the 4 division commanders in front of them wasn't a match for 100 or 1,000 men? Why would they worry about a surrendered general who didn't have a weapon? Immediately, the ropes were untied, and a chair was placed in front of him. Even though he was still a bit scared, Wanyan Hong still forced himself to be calm and sat on the chair. Following that, his gaze swept across the faces of the 4 division commanders. The 2 guards had already retreated, leaving only 5 people in the large tent. In a situation where no one spoke, the atmosphere was a bit frighteningly quiet. This was especially true for Wanyan Hong. When he felt the pressure from the 4 division commanders who were filled with killing intent, it was impossible for him to pretend to be calm. Large amounts of sweat began to flow out from his forehead. Even though the weather at this time didn't exceed 10 degrees at night, Wanyan Hong still felt his body heat up and his heart was fluttering. Just when he felt that he couldn't withstand this aura anymore, Gong Feng spoke. It was as if a blazing sun shone on his body in the cold winter, causing him to feel warmth all over his body. "You're called Wanyan Hong? Don't be nervous. What did you mean by surrendering?" "Oh, this little one is called Wanyan Hong. I'm the personal guard captain of General Dexy, sent by the Kazakh Khanate. This time I came here to—" Wanyan Hong repeated what he had wanted to say in his heart. At this time, he still kept a secret. He only said that if he surrendered, would the 5-star army accept them and how they would be treated. He didn't say that he had already controlled General Dexy and Harsenhan from the Ilkhanate. Wanyan Hong wasn't sure if the 5-star army would accept his surrender. If they couldn't accept it, then he would just fight. His principle was that if someone didn't let him have an easy time, then he wouldn't let them have an easy time either. Wanyan Hong's tone was probing. When the other 3 division commanders heard this, they all revealed an impatient expression. They thought that Wanyan Hong was negotiating with them. How could the world's #1 cavalry army allow a defeated army to negotiate with them? On the other hand, Gong Feng gave the other 3 division commanders a look to calm them down. Then he laughed and said, "Wanyan, it should be a big surname. I wonder if General Wanyan Hong is related to it." It had to be said that this was the benefit of studying. Gong Feng was Yang Chendong's student, so he naturally knew a lot. When he asked this question, Wanyan Hong's body shook, and he lowered his head. Looking at this scene, Gong Feng's intuition told him that Wanyan Hong should be related to the Wanyan clan. He laughed and said, "What? Is there something that you can't say?" "Oh, no. Since the general has asked, there's no harm in telling you. Actually, my ancestor is the Wanyan clan. We were defeated by the Kazakh Khanate and became their captives. Because my performance was good, General Dexy took a fancy to me and appointed me as the captain of the Kazakh Khanate." When Wanyan Hong spoke of this, he could clearly feel the heaviness in his heart. Although it was summarized in 2 simple sentences, he must have experienced a lot of things. Moreover, it should be very sad. When he heard this, Gong Feng's expression became better. His intuition told him that this should be a breakthrough that would greatly benefit their following work. "Oh, so it's like this. It seems like we have more things to talk about with Brother Wanyan. At least we have the same enemy, right? The same enemy?" Wanyan Hong's face was filled with confusion. "Yes, the Kazakh Khanate is our common enemy. If you are willing, we can help your Wanyan clan take revenge." Gong Feng nodded solemnly and said, "At that time, as long as we break through the Kazakh Khanate, we can save your suffering clansmen and return them their freedom. At that time, you, Wanyan Hong, will be the benefactor of the entire Wanyan clan. Hee hee. Of course, if you want us to do this, you have to show some sincerity. For example, help us deal with the enemies in front of us." First, the 5-star army fought 100,000 against 100,000, entangling his main force. Next, the 5-star army fought 30,000 against 100,000 and won, driving away Harsan Khan's troops, shocking many people. Then, The Norman Khaganate was destroyed by the five-star army through a sneak attack. This made Amor extremely shocked. He could not figure out how the five-star army did it. And now, an even more severe test was placed in front of him. The five-star army actually changed the direction of their advance and headed straight for his Timur Empire. As the most powerful existence among the Khaganates, the Timur Empire was located in the middle of all the Khaganates. This was their advantage. They could suddenly dispatch troops to attack any Khaganate at any time, but at the same time, it was also their disadvantage. They could dispatch troops to attack from any Khaganate. In the past, the Timur Empire was the dominant power. The other small Khaganates nearby only thought about how to curry favor with him. How could they think of attacking him? Therefore, he was not worried. But now, with the appearance of the five-star army, they would not carry out their plan. When he heard that the five-star army had dispatched troops to the Timur Empire from the Ilkhanate and the Norman Khaganate, Amor was indeed frightened and angry. He was angry at the arrogance of the five-star army, but also worried about whether he could block the enemy's advance. Men, summon great General Manjalatu. Who was a little flustered, decided to do something. He couldn't continue to wait like this. Otherwise, not to mention that he wouldn't be able to realize his ambitions, whether he could establish a foothold in the world would become a very serious problem. Manjalatu was fully deserving of the title of Great General of the Timur Empire. This person was extremely capable. On the battlefield, he was also known as the King of 100 Victories. It was rumored that when the nearby Khaganates heard his name, children would stop crying. From this, it could be seen how influential he was. After being summoned into the hall, Manjalatu strode in front of Amor. Without waiting for him to salute, Amor asked in a hurried tone, "Great General, you should be aware of the situation. Do you have any way to deal with the enemy? It's just a two-legged sheep. It's not a big deal." Manjalatu, who was not tall and had a face full of beard, smiled conceitedly with a look of indifference. For some reason, after seeing Manjalatu's performance, Amor, who was originally somewhat anxious, calmed down a lot. "Oh, but what is the great general's arrangement?" "It's very simple. We'll just have to deal with whatever comes our way. The enemy is coming from afar. Their provisions will definitely be insufficient. We only need to fight a war of attrition with them. We can delay them until they have no choice but to retreat. Moreover, our Timur Empire has a lot of water plants, mountains, and lakes. We can use this advantageous terrain to deal with them. In short, we don't need to fight a big battle. Our main goal is to harass and harass them. As long as we can hold on for a while, the enemy will have no choice but to consider retreating." Amor nodded in satisfaction after hearing this. However, he felt that the other party had not finished speaking, so he asked tentatively, "But I wonder if there are any other methods?" "Of course there are, Great Khan. We can send people to contact Bangladesh and provide them with gold and silver. Let them send troops to harass the rear of the five-star army. When the rear is on fire, the five-star army will not be able to fight a war of attrition with us here. At that time, we can divert the trouble and stabilize the situation." Manjalata's face was full of confidence. Obviously, he had already prepared for this. "Good. This Khan has the great general's help. It's just a two-legged sheep. What is there to fear?" So, the 250,000 cavalrymen in the country will all be handed over to the great general. This Khan will wait for the good news of the great general's victory. Amor laughed and handed over the military power. Over the past few years, the Timur Empire had prepared a total of 350,000 cavalrymen, which was definitely a powerful force. Even when the Golden Horde was at its peak, the Timur Empire still couldn't compare to it. They still had to rely on the Sherkas people and the Alans to fight against the Five-Star Army. Just from this aspect alone, the Timur Empire was clearly a bit more powerful. After handing over everything to Manjalatu, Amor waited for the final result. He was full of confidence in the great general. At this time, Yang Chendong, who was rushing from the Ilkhanate to the Timur Empire, also learned about Manjalatu from the intelligence department. Chapter 1507. There was quite a bit of information that was sent over, all of it showing how troublesome and terrifying this person was. Even Yang Chendong felt that this person was a bit troublesome. He had a feeling that this person's existence would greatly hinder his great plan of unifying the Timur Empire. Inform Chushi to come down and meet me. After Yang Chendong threw down these words to Badeo Jiang, who was accompanying him, he continued to look through all of the information related to the Timur Empire in his hands. He was considering a suitable path of advance. Right now, it wasn't only their army that was rushing towards the Timur Empire. Apart from the 4 divisions of the world's #1 cavalry army, as well as the Russian division, all of the other 5-star army, totaling over 300,000, were converging here from all directions. There was no need to talk about the world's #1 cavalry army. They had already taken down the capital of the Ilkhanate, Buli-Tuching, and were preparing to take a small path to the rear of the Kazakh Khanate. They were going straight for the capital, striving to open up a path there. This way, they would be able to meet up with the 5-star army in the east. Once this matter was accomplished, it would be the same as opening up an important path for supplies. This would play a decisive role in prolonging the army's ability to fight. Even Yang Chendong didn't think that Tian, whose #1 cavalry army, would do this. When he received the telegram, he was excited for quite a while. Ahuli's Russian division was currently clearing out the remnants of the Allied forces in the Ilkhanate. After several battles, the Allied forces could be said to have suffered successive defeats. The original 300,000 Allied forces were now reduced to less than 60,000. Ahuli, this valiant general, took responsibility for this matter. It had to be said that he was worthy of being someone who had once been a great Khan. He really did have a way of leading troops. According to the telegram, Ahuli had already fought against the Allied forces of the Ilkhanate 8 times and suffered defeat once. Apart from these 2 armies, Yang Chendong had mobilized all of the forces he could currently mobilize. From this, it could be seen how much importance he attached to the Timur Empire. It could also be said that once the Timur Empire was taken down, the so-called Khanate alliance would be disbanded. What followed would be encirclement and suppression. This also meant that the Yangtze's territory had expanded by at least a third. And in order to achieve this goal, they had to get rid of the Timur Empire first. And if they wanted to destroy the Timur Empire, they had to get rid of Mandu Latu, who was a difficult general to deal with. Otherwise, if the army was really exhausted here and the provisions couldn't be transported up in time, once summer passed and winter came, they would only have one path left, which was to retreat. This also meant that all their previous efforts would be ruined in an instant. This was not something Yang Chendong could accept. In order to prevent things from developing in this direction, he had to attack fiercely and try to take down the Timur Empire in the shortest time possible. The Timur Empire's environment and landscape were very complicated. There were many deserts, and there were very few places that were suitable for cavalry to fight. It was completely different from the time when they were dealing with the Golden Horde, where both sides appeared in a decisive battle. That was how they achieved victory in the shortest time possible. Shaking his head, he carefully looked at the map and some information, but he could not find a place or opportunity for the decisive battle. Yang Chendong could not help but sigh. It seems that we can only push forward slowly. I hope that Tian, Hu, and the others can succeed and join forces with the East Army to solve the urgent need for provisions. In the 15th century, most of the land of the Kazakh Khanate was separated from the Golden Horde and became part of the Yuebi Khanate. Later, some tribes broke away from the Yuebi Khanate's rule and were called escapees and gradually formed the Kazakh people. The Kazakh Khanate's territory was inhabited by nomadic Turkic people. It was because of this that they were a people that could fight, and were also a people that liked to fight. The capital, Akimo, was also built more than a decade ago. Although it was called a city, it was actually just a slightly larger market. There were some walls made of earth around the city. They were not high, only about 1 zhang high. In the end, it was just for show, because if a war really broke out, they did not expect to rely on these walls to defend anything. At that time, they would rush out on horseback with all of their belongings. This also allowed them to move faster. Unless they were completely surrounded, it would be very difficult to eliminate them. It was because of this that the 5-star army on the East Front could not find the main force to engage in a decisive battle. More often than not, when they received the news, they would rush over empty-handed. In the end, they could only move forward bit by bit and were unable to join forces with Yang Qindong on the West Front. Relying on this kind of fast-moving method, the Kazakh Khanate's Jainurbek Khan was not afraid of the 5-star army's attack. As long as he received the news, he would immediately leave. When the other side missed, he would consider cutting off the 5-star army's supply line, thus forcing the other side to retreat and give up the territory that they had just occupied. This kind of strategy gave the 5-star army an endless headache. Before they could eliminate the other side's strength, it was impossible for them to occupy those so-called earth walls. This was because unless they were heavily guarded, they would face the other side's counterattack at any time. Thus, there was the possibility of being swallowed up. This was the biggest problem in dealing with the Kazakh Khanate. The 5-star army had outstanding bravery and elite cavalry, but they were still unable to deal with the other side. And all of this would change with the appearance of the 1st Cavalry Division, led by Tian, who, with Wanyan Hong's help, the more than 40,000 brave warriors of the 1st Heavenly Cavalry Army set out from the Ilkhanate's capital, Tabuli Tuching, making a detour around the Timur Empire's territory, quietly cutting into the Kazakh Khanate's rear. Wanyan Hong was worthy of being a descendant of the Wanyan clan. He was extremely familiar with the situation in this area. The path that he pointed out was indeed unknown. Along the way, they didn't encounter any traces of enemies. According to what he said, they would be able to enter the Kazakh Khanate's territory in, at most, half a month. Then, they would be able to reach Akimo City in 10 days. Then, they would be able to secretly deal a fierce blow to Janibek Khan and eliminate as much of the other side's strength as possible. The next 25 days would be the most crucial period. Their tracks absolutely couldn't be discovered. For this reason, Tian, who took the initiative to send a telegram to Yang Qindong, requesting the 6th Young Master's help and cooperation. This was because apart from being discovered by the Kazakh cavalry, Tian, who was also worried that they would be discovered by the Timur Empire's cavalry. After all, that Mandarattle wasn't a good person. Once he discovered their tracks, he feared that the entire 1st Cavalry Division would face the grim situation of being surrounded from all sides. After receiving Tian, whose telegram, Yang Qindong ordered the army to attack from all sides in order to divert Mandarattle's attention. At the same time, all of the Air Force's hot air balloons were deployed as guides. In other words, once the hot air balloons discovered the target, they could also drop explosive packs from the air before the 5-star army's cavalry arrived. In short, they couldn't let the Timur Empire's soldiers be idle. They had to create a feeling of war everywhere. This way, they wouldn't have the time to care about anything else. This would create an even more favorable situation for the 1st Cavalry Division to advance. The 5-star army launched a frenzied attack. Almost every day, there would be large and small-scale battles. Under Mandaradel's command, the 250,000 Timur Empire's cavalry also launched multiple attacks. Using their understanding of the environment, they started a game of hide-and-seek with the five-star army. They were very skilled in using Sun Tzu's art of wars. When the enemy advances, I will retreat. When the enemy retreats, I will disturb them. Just like that, half a month passed. The five-star army launched many attacks, but the results were few and far between. The army was also exhausted. Yang Qindong finally received a telegram from Tian Hu. They had successfully passed through the Timur Empire and entered the Kazakh region. He ordered the army to retreat and find a safe place to rest and reorganize. After entering the Timur Empire, the five-star army's first attack ended. When the news of them stopping the attack reached the capital, Ahmet Khan Amur's face was beaming with joy. His frowning face for the past few months was swept away, and he cheered a few times. On the same night, the entire capital fell into a carnival, especially great General Mandaradel. Everyone killed sheep, ate meat, drank wine, and played all night. In contrast, the atmosphere in the five-star army's camps was somewhat gloomy. After attacking for half a month, the number of enemies destroyed was not even 10,000 cavalry. Moreover, the other side was already prepared. They had scorched the walls and cleared the field, so there was no harvest in terms of food. This was naturally rare for the five-star army. In the past, as long as they decided to attack, they would definitely gain a lot. This time, it was the sixth young master who personally gave the order, but they still got such a result. Many people couldn't accept it. In the end, they could only comfort themselves with the excuse that even immortals would take a nap, and the sixth young master wouldn't be too difficult. Beta Persei had already returned to Yang Qindong's side with the Black Cavalry. In the past half a month, he had been tormenting himself a lot, but unfortunately, he couldn't touch the enemy's main force at all. When he finally found the enemy's figure, the enemy would drill into the mountains, making it impossible for him to chase after them. Beta Persei didn't like this kind of fighting method, where he couldn't find an opponent at all. In the end, he had no choice but to return to Yang Qindong's side. As soon as he returned, he heard the voices of the soldiers below. There were actually people who dared to doubt the young master. This was something that Beta Persei couldn't tolerate. He secretly called Qiu Vi, Dao Xiao, Ba Dao Jiang, and the other leaders of the Black Cavalry, and asked them to find those who were suspicious. He wanted to teach a few of them a lesson and punish them according to the law. But for some reason, Yang Qindong found out about this matter. He called the Black Cavalry and stopped them in public. Their mouths are on other people's bodies. We can't interfere with what they think. As long as it doesn't affect the morale of the army, we don't need to care. Chapter 1508. Yang Qindong said these words so confidently, but when they fell into the ears of Beta Persei and the others, they had no choice but to suppress the anger in their hearts. But at the same time, this confidence infected them. The matter of Tian, who entering the Kazakh Khanate, is top secret. In order to prevent it from being leaked, Yang Qindong didn't even tell Beta Persei about it. It's not that he doesn't trust them, but he's worried that after telling them, these people will talk about it in a moment of happiness. If this news gets out, it will be bad. Since it's easy to cause all kinds of problems, it's better not to say it. It just so happens that he also took this opportunity to see what kind of performance the other senior generals in the army will have. If someone is full of complaints because of a moment of dissatisfaction, or even has other ideas, it's tantamount to a pleasant surprise, and he can get rid of such a black sheep. For this reason, a total of 120 intelligence personnel were secretly sent to the various armies and began to investigate the reaction of all sides. time passed day by day like this. For days later, outside the general's mansion in Herat City, Chuishich came with two jonins to collect some things. Before the war began, they were sent here to carry out the decapitation operation and get rid of the great enemy Mandaratu. But from the moment he received this task, Chuishich knew that this task is not easy to complete, or even impossible to complete. However, even though he knew this, he still had to come because this was Yang Qindong's intention. No matter what kind of thoughts this Han held, since he had spoken, he had to carry it out. Just like Yang Qindong never believes in aliens, Chuishich also doesn't completely believe in Yang Qindong, although all the training costs are now paid by Yang Qindong. In fact, the two sides are more of a cooperative relationship. After all, ninjas have been taught for hundreds of years. In their bones, the Japanese Empire is their home, their root. Now, they have to live for the people who once destroyed their roots, which is a bit unacceptable from a psychological point of view. On this point, not only was Chushi aware of it, he believed that the other two special ninja brothers, Kitamura and Yui Suzuki, were also aware of it. The three of them had made a lot of preparations for this. For example, they had secretly accumulated money and made all sorts of preparations to leave the five-star army. It had to be said that in some aspects, Yang Qindong was very generous. In order to make the ninjas work for him, any materials they request every month will be fully satisfied. Every time he was able to save 20%, it was not a small fortune. Over time, he had accumulated quite a lot over the past few years. Just as he was about to become independent, Blowing Stone received the order to be transferred to the front lines. Because he wasn't fully prepared, Blowing Stone had to say goodbye to his two brothers and come here. The last time he was ordered to protect Yang Qindong, Blowing Stone wanted to see if he could use Ivan to kill Yang Qindong. Unfortunately, Ivan was an impulsive young man. He wasn't fully prepared. Blowing Stone thought that even if he wanted to go easy on Yang Qindong, he wouldn't be able to hurt Yang Qindong. This is because they know that in terms of individual combat power, King Wunan of Damyang is even more abnormal. Although they have never seen him in action, they heard that even the strongest black cavalry can't be his opponent. This can be seen from Yang Qindong's disappearance and the defeat of Yeshin's 30,000 Walla army. This person clearly has a backup plan. In other words, he doesn't fully trust him. Thinking about how he almost believed that this was a good opportunity to make a move, Blowing Stone couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. Of course, Blowing Stone didn't know that the reason why Yesen lost was because he lost to Daikra, not because Yang Qindong was prepared. Not knowing the truth, Blowing Stone thought that he didn't have Yang Qindong's trust at all. Because of this, he also had other thoughts about this mission. In his opinion, this was the method of that person driving the wolf to devour the tiger. To put it bluntly, if the assassination was successful, it would be best. It would help him complete the mission. But if Mandu La Tu really died as the murderer, it would be difficult for Blowing Stone to escape Herat. In the end, he couldn't avoid death. On the other hand, if the assassination didn't succeed, it would be difficult for him to escape. In the end, he would still die. If that was the case, Yang Qindong wouldn't be sad, because in that person's eyes, he was someone who couldn't be trusted. If he died, then he died. Therefore, this mission was basically a dilemma. If he made a move, he would die, but if he didn't, he would be disobeying orders. Death was the only option, and this feeling made Blowing Stone very uncomfortable. He couldn't help but think of that person, the person who secretly contacted them. Maybe he should consider cooperating with that person. At least the result can't be worse, right? If their leader wasn't Yang Qindong, then Blowing Stone wouldn't have so much pressure. Others can't control his own fate. Thinking of the words that the man had hinted at, Blowing Stone had an idea. At this time, they just walked around the general's mansion, and Blowing Stone finally said, "The situation is clear. Is there any problem if we do it tonight?" "No problem." The two behind him replied softly. "Very good." When Blowing Stone said this sentence, there was a trace of unbearable expression on his face. Once the fight starts, these two ninjas, who have followed him for many years, won't live past tonight. But even if he knows this, he can't say anything. Just like how Yang Qindong doesn't easily trust others, he also doesn't dare to trust the ninjas under him. Who knows if they have been bribed by Yang Qindong all this time? Ninjas often choose a dark and windy night to make a move, which is more conducive to their actions. Tonight is a good night. Because of the clouds, there is no moonlight, and this is a good opportunity for the ninjas to show their strength. In the general's mansion, Mandu Latu was standing in front of the map in his study. Others are immersed in the great joy of defeating the five-star army at the moment. But as the commander of the army, he didn't get carried away by the victory. Speaking of which, in this half-a-month's battle, the Timur cavalry did not gain any advantage. Instead, they lost more than 8,000 cavalry. On the contrary, according to the information they received, they only killed less than 1,000 soldiers of the 5th Astral Corps. This is a complete defeat. It was only because the five-star army had become a scourge in everyone's eyes. Therefore, in many people's eyes, if they could stall the five-star army until they couldn't win, it would be their victory. That was why there was this celebration. This battle made Mandu Latu more aware of the strength and sharpness of the five-star army. But at the same time, it also made him feel that something is wrong. He had studied the past of the five-star army before. This was an army that always had a clear goal when they attacked. Why would they fight randomly this time? The battle that had lasted for half a month seemed to be completely random. Even if it was him, he wouldn't command such a chaotic battle. At least they would try to test it. For example, if a lone army went deep into the capital to see if there's an opportunity to take the head of a general, and so on. But the five-star army didn't do this at all. They just kept attacking, retreating, and advancing. This made Mandu Latu very puzzled, and he began to reflect on whether he missed something, or the reason why the five-star army did this is to hide something. But what are they trying to hide? This is the so-called abnormal thing. There must be a demon. The five-star army doesn't play by the rules. This is what Mandu Latu can't figure out. And if he can't figure out the situation of the other side, then it's not impossible for him to suffer a loss or even die. Standing in front of the map, Mandu Latu didn't move for a long time. He was still thinking about any possibilities. He didn't believe that the commander of the Ross Principality, who defeated the Golden Horde, would make such a stupid move and attack without a goal. Often, the more aimless the attack, the more likely it is that he is carrying out a secret plan. But what is this plan? On the map, Manjalatl slowly moved. Unconsciously, he looked at the Kazakh Khanate to the northwest of the Timur Empire. He seemed to have thought of something. His hand involuntarily moved towards that direction on the map. Assassins, protect the general. It was at this moment that a sudden voice broke Manjalat's train of thought, causing his original inspiration to disappear completely. It was completely disrupted by the shouts outside the door, and it disappeared without a trace. Outside the door, the ninjas finally made their move. But just like what Yushi had imagined before, as an existence second only to Great Khan Amor in the Timur Empire, Mandu Latu's safety was naturally the top priority. So how could he be easily assassinated? The 50 ninjas just arrived at the inner courtyard, but they were discovered by the guards in charge of the general's safety. In a short period of time, the entire inner courtyard was brightly lit. In such an environment, it was no different from daytime. Without the darkness that the ninjas relied on, they were like tigers with their teeth pulled out. They lacked a deadly weapon to deal with the enemy. The 50 ninjas were surrounded in all corners, but none of them were waiting for death. This may have something to do with the education they have been receiving. Even if they die, they will die on the way, and they will not choose to surrender. Without the cover of darkness, the ability shown by these ninjas is equivalent to ordinary elite soldiers. Under the siege of more and more Mongolian soldiers, one ninja after another died, tragically in the inner courtyard. Some ninjas even closed their eyes after being stabbed several times. Chapter 1509. In a small courtyard on a street not far from the general's mansion, a black shadow wearing a black suit was sitting there with his eyes closed. He was one of the special ninjas of the province. Just a moment ago, he had led 50 ninjas to sneak out of the great general's mansion. But unknowingly he had retreated. Yes, he had betrayed his ninjas in order to save his own life. And all of this was not because he was afraid of death, but because he had a greater goal to achieve, such as the independence of the ninjas. In order to achieve this goal, he did not hesitate to sacrifice the lives of these 50 ninjas. And from this moment on, he would temporarily disappear from everyone's sight. He would look for that person, the person who had given them the hint. Perhaps that person was the only hope for them to escape from the great general's control and regain their freedom. In the great general's mansion, the assassination was over after half an hour. All of the ninjas were killed, and the Mongolian army had paid a price of 130 people. From this, it could be seen that the individual combat strength of a ninja was still very strong. Even if they were surrounded, even if they could not show their best side, they still managed to injure their opponents. Manjalatu was inspecting the corpses on the ground under the close protection of his personal guards. After the experienced people confirmed that these were the legendary ninjas of the Japanese Empire, there was not a trace of fear on Manjalatu's face. Instead, he laughed as if he had survived a disaster. He finally figured out why the 5-star army had done so much useless work for half a month. It turned out that this was their purpose. It was to make him relax his vigilance and create an opportunity for these ninjas. Fortunately, he had always been careful and cautious, so he was spared. As if he had finally figured out the matter, Manjalatu's face was full of a sense of relief. He wanted to see what tricks the 5-star army had up their sleeves. At the same time, he wanted to hang the corpses of these assassins on the city wall. He wanted to let everyone know that the Han people had tried to assassinate him. He wanted everyone to know that he, Manjalatu, was not afraid of being beaten, and he could not be killed. The personal guards moved quickly. In just the morning, the corpses of the 50 ninjas were hung on the city wall for all the Mongolians to see. Among them were members of Yang Xie's intelligence department. They quickly sent the news back by telegram and asked for instructions on what to do next. Yang Qindong was not surprised when he heard the news. If Manjalatu could be killed so easily, then he wouldn't be worthy of being the 5-star army's opponent. Let them investigate, check all the deceased, and record their appearances and specific numbers. They are all heroes. If they have family members, they should be compensated generously. This matter seemed to have passed just like that. In order to express his anger, Yang Qindong even intentionally sent out 5,000 cavalrymen to search for the main force of the Mongolian cavalrymen, intending to have a decisive battle. Unfortunately, even though Manjalatu was prepared, he still couldn't find anything. On the other hand, the 5-star army didn't dare to advance too far due to the lack of food. In the end, they had no choice but to retreat. Along the way from the Golden Horde, they had already used up 70% of the food they brought. With less than 30% left before new food arrived, it was impossible for the army to advance without a goal. Unless they could find the main force of the Mongol army and fight them, or they had new rations to replenish their supplies, the 5-Star Legion could only retreat from here and find a way out. The battlefield fell into a stalemate. Man Do-La-Tu looked at this scene silently. He even had a bold idea. Before winter came, if the 5-Star Army still held on and didn't retreat, he would launch a large-scale counterattack. He wanted to see what kind of fighting strength an army without food and soldiers without enough to eat could have. On the battlefield, the 5-Star Army's main force seemed to have fallen into a passive state. With the cooperation of Wanyan Hong, Tian, who finally brought the main force of the World Cavalry Army to the outskirts of the Kazakh capital, Akmo. On a nearby hill, Tian, who used his binoculars and could already see the short earthen walls. He could also see many Mongolian citizens carrying out various transactions within the walls. This is the capital of Kazakh. Tian, who you asked with a hint of doubt when he saw how simple and crude everything was. In fact, it wasn't even as good as a village in Crimson City. This was of course not a question, but a sigh. Wanyan Hong saw this and didn't answer this question. Instead, he lowered his head in shame. Evidently, he also felt a bit embarrassed. After all, being poor wasn't something to be proud of. All right, don't be sad. Believe me, once the people of your Wanyan clan become the people of our Yang family, their lives will certainly become better and better. There will be earth-shaking changes. At that time, your clansmen will thank you for generations. Hee hee. Feeling the change in Wanyan Hong's mood, Tian, who patted the latter's shoulder to comfort him. Then he said to the 4 division commanders who came with him, "Have you all seen the terrain clearly? Remember it well. We will have a meeting when we go back. Tonight, we will launch the attack." When he said this, Tian, who also felt a bit relieved. This operation is a bit risky. Now that I think about it, I only listened to Wanyan Hong's side of the story. If something goes wrong, I'm afraid that the entire No. 1 Cavalry Army will suffer a heavy loss. It's not an exaggeration to say that the 4 divisions, and I might even lose our lives here. Fortunately, Wanyan Hong didn't disappoint him. The matter was finally completed. The target was right in front of him, and he didn't show any signs of vigilance. This made Tian, who very confident about the next attack plan. After bringing the 4 division commanders back to the camp 12 miles away, Tian, who immediately ordered all the soldiers to take out all the food and finish it in one meal. This was to ensure that they had enough energy to complete the mission. In fact, even if they took out all the food, they would only be 70% full. After running continuously for such a long time, the World Cavalry Army's rations had already been depleted. This was the importance of logistics in a war. Since Yang Qindong established the 5-Star Army, he had never been so worried about food. In the past, when deciding where to send troops, he would always prepare enough rations in advance. In the process of battle, the rations would be continuously delivered through various channels. Even when they were fighting against the Golden Horde and the Ross Duchy, there were still millions of people working hard. Countless military provisions were sent from the Yang's provinces to the 3 eastern provinces, and then from there to the far eastern province. It seemed that Yang Qindong's war was like a hot knife through butter. But in reality, the credit of the logistics personnel couldn't be less. It was because of the logistics that the soldiers at the front lines could fight the enemy without worry. They didn't have to worry about not having food to eat, clothes to wear if they were cold, or medicine to use if they were injured. But when they entered the Ilkhanate from Eastern Europe, the 5-Star Army's pace was a little too big. Along the way, many places only surrendered and weren't destroyed. Naturally, they weren't considered Yang Xie's territory, and it was because of the instability of their retreat that when the 5-Star Army's main force left, they quickly went back on their words and didn't recognize Yang Xie as their sovereign state. At this time, it was impossible to transport rations from there. If they insisted on doing so, They were afraid that no matter how much they transported, they would be robbed. In the end, not a single grain of rice would fall into the hands of the Five-Star Army. And it was precisely because the rations were cut off that Mandu Latu confidently faced the Five-Star Army and played guerrilla warfare. The Five-Star Army couldn't find their main force and didn't know where the enemy's main cavalry was. They didn't dare to advance rashly. Otherwise, it would be easy for their retreat to be cut off, and they would be surrounded one by one. The Five-Star Army was strong, and their combat power was incomparable to that of an ordinary army. They even had a pure firearms unit like the Cold Front. If they faced the enemy head-on, they wouldn't be afraid of any enemy. But if the enemy used a sneak attack and made use of the terrain to launch a sudden attack, the Five-Star Army wouldn't be able to withstand it. Especially in a situation where they were severely lacking in rations, the more they moved, the more they would consume. It was because of this that Yang Qindong placed all his hopes on Tian, whose world's first cavalry army. If they couldn't break through this time, then they would have to retreat without accomplishing anything. How could Tian, who not understand this? After being a high-ranking officer for so many years, he still had some foresight. Thus, he was even more clear about the importance of this mission. After returning to the camp, he called for the 4 division commanders. The 5 of them discussed for more than 2 hours and finally came up with the most reliable method of attack. In summary, they had to take down Akamo City and lure the enemy back for reinforcements. This would open up a path and opportunity for the Five-Star Army's main force on the Eastern Front. As long as they could join forces with the Five-Star Army on the Eastern Front, it would be equivalent to having a stable route for the transportation of rations. They could also use this route to continuously send in supplies needed for war. Regarding this point, Yang Qindong had already sent a telegram to the various armies on the Eastern Front 25 days ago to let them prepare. 4 division commanders, the 6th young master is watching us. The entire army is watching us. Next, it's time for the world's first cavalry army to perform. Remember, this time, not only do we have to take down Akamo City, we also have to open up a safe route to the east. This mission will be handed over to the 2nd and 3rd Division. Now, as the commander, I give you the authority to act as you see fit. If you encounter anyone who doesn't cooperate, you can end it on your own. You can kill without mercy and don't have to worry about anyone coming after you. If necessary, you can build a few more temples to warn others. As he spoke, Tian, whose body emitted a murderous aura. Chapter 15:10. 2nd Division's Commander Lu Duo and 3rd Division's Commander Hubo stood up and stood at attention. Rest assured, Commander, we guarantee that we will complete the mission. We promise to open the passage as soon as possible and meet up with our main forces in the east. Very good. Everyone, go and prepare. Tian, who nodded in satisfaction. He was full of confidence in his cavalry. For hours after the meeting, more than 40,000 Five-Star Army cavalrymen set off. They were only 12 kilometers away from their target. They did not take any measures to conceal themselves. After the order was given, the 1st Division's commander Te Mu took the lead and attacked. For the world's #1 cavalry army, who were proficient in archery and horse riding, a distance of 12 li was nothing. They could guarantee that even if they were discovered by the enemy, they would not give the enemy any time to prepare for defense. In Akamo City, inside a huge yurt, this was Janabek Khan's residence. Compared to the previous days, his emotions were much more stable. This was because Mandu Latu had stopped the Five-Star Army's attack on the Western Front. It was already the beginning of July. They only needed to hold on for 2 more months before winter arrived. If the Five-Star Army still couldn't build up their defenses, then they could only retreat. This would give them time to rest and recuperate, although it was not a victory, since they could stop the Five-Star Army's first attack, who could guarantee that they would not be able to stop the second. This at least gave the Khanate's coalition army, which had been losing, hope. It had a strong effect on the army's morale. This was something that could not be bought with money. Thinking that it would not be long before the Five-Star Army left dejectedly, Janibek Khan had a smile on his face even when he was sleeping. And all of this disappeared because of the sudden tremors that came from the ground. The smile would never appear again. Report: enemy attack. Enemy attack. The scouts on the periphery finally discovered the traces of the Five-Star Army. However, just as Tian Hu had predicted, the speed of the Five-Star Army's cavalry was simply too fast. By the time the scout returned with the news, the vanguard of the 1st Division had already arrived outside the city. They were only a stone's throw away from the earth wall. The scout's shout attracted the counterattack of the 500 Kazakh cavalrymen who were on night duty. They all came to the back of the earthen wall and used it as cover to shoot arrows outside. But to the brave warriors of the world's #1 cavalry army, who were like ferocious tigers descending from the mountains, they were completely ignored. In addition, in the dark night, vision was limited to begin with. Many arrows were released, but they were all off target. Not many soldiers of the Five-Star Army were injured. The earthen walls were destroyed by the prepared soldiers of the Five-Star Army using the huge logs they brought. Without the protection of the earthen wall, the entire city of Akimo was defenseless in front of the Five-Star Army soldiers. Soon after, the sound of countless armored cavalrymen could be heard. At this time, Janibek Khan had just crawled out of his bed. When he heard the news of the Five-Star Army's attack from his personal guards, his eyes widened in disbelief. How could the Five-Star Army appear here? The Ili Empire to the east and the Timur Empire to the west. How did the Five-Star Army bypass them and arrive in front of him? What was going on? Could it be that these cavalrymen flew here? With all kinds of puzzlement in his heart, Janibek Khan escaped under the protection of his personal guards 15 minutes before the arrival of the Five-Star Army. Because he left in a hurry, he did not have time to take many things with him. Even his blanket still had a trace of warmth. The 1st Division's commander, Tae-Mu, was the first to rush into the Khan's tent. When he saw that there was no one there, he strode forward and touched the blanket. He frowned and said, "It's still warm. What a pity." Even the great Khan had fled without any resistance or counterattack, not to mention the Kazakh cavalry in the city. There were less than 10,000 of them, and in less than 2 hours of fighting in front of the more than 40,000 ferocious soldiers of the world's #1 cavalry army, they either died, fled, or surrendered. In the end, the 80,000 Mongolian civilians in the city were all captured and enslaved by the Five-Star Army. The battle went very smoothly. When Tian Hu walked into the Khan's tent, he was in high spirits. As he walked, he ordered, "Immediately find all the food in the city. Let the 2nd Division and the 3rd Division eat first. After that, let them set out the day after tomorrow. We must take advantage of the time when the enemy is unprepared to kill our way out. Also, call the 1st Division and the 4th Division over. We also need to discuss the issue of defending the city. This earthen wall is really not sturdy. We must immediately rebuild it and use everything we can, including the civilians in the city, to dig trenches. No matter what, before the army arrives, we must be nailed here like a nail." When he said this, Tian Hu's eyes were filled with determination. If the surprise attack on Akmo was the first step to success, then defending this place was the second step. It was also the most difficult step. Tian Hu could even imagine that once the enemy knew that there was such a nail in their heart, they would not be able to resist pulling it out. When Akmo fell, Janibek Khan only managed to escape with less than 1,000 Kazakh cavalry. When the news began to spread, Mandulato, who heard the news, immediately smashed the desk in front of him and shouted angrily, "Trash! A bunch of trash!" After venting his anger, Mandulato calmed down and felt the threat. He did not know how the five-star army had bypassed his front line. He had to find a way to eliminate them. He absolutely could not tolerate a fierce tiger lying by his side. He also could not allow the five-star army on the east and west to converge. Otherwise, it would be the beginning of a disaster. At this moment, Mandulato finally understood that the crazy and brainless attacks of the Fifth Star Army in the past half a month were not to cover up those killers, but to attract his attention so that the cavalry of the Fifth Star Army could pass right under his nose. It had to be said that even though he was very careful, he was still careless and fell into the Five-Star Army's trap. Or it could be said that he fell into the trap of King Wunan of Daimyeong. Men, send out 80,000 cavalry. No matter what, we must capture Akmo City and kill all the Five-Star Army's cavalry there. Kill them all. After enduring for so long, Mandulato finally decided to reveal his fangs. His first target was the world's first cavalry army that was nailed into Akmo City, like a nail. Once this nail was pulled out, the next target would be the 20,000-strong Five-Star Army's cavalry that was about to attack from behind and join the Five-Star Army on the East Front. Mandulato did not believe that it was only 20,000 cavalry. Could they really overturn the heavens? The same news also spread to the Five-Star Army's camp on the West Front. At this moment, everyone knew that the sixth young master's actions had such a deep meaning. Some of the officers who had complained could not help but feel ashamed. For this reason, many officers actually knelt in front of the main tent and apologized to Yang Chendong in person. In response, Yang Chendong only arranged for Beta Persei to come forward and admonish them. He had already investigated and found that these complaining officers had the intention of thinking for the army. No one had any ulterior motives because of this. This did not cross his bottom line, so naturally he would not punish them too harshly. This was probably the effect of Gray's death. Although there were quite a few people who suspected that Yang Chendong was the culprit behind Gray's death, after considering that he had indeed done something that was not allowed by military discipline, coupled with his frightening arrogance in the later stages of his life, such a person's death was not worth pitying. Furthermore, although Gray had died, he had died fighting for the Five-Star Army in name. As a result, his family had received quite a bit of compensation. With this, they had both money and face, and no one would step forward to seek justice for them. If he could make 70% of the people reach this standard, then he would not even dare to think about it. However, after visiting for 4 years, he found that Yang Chendong was not just bragging. Instead, he really did what he said. Although the common people's wealth did not reach 100%, it was at least 80%. Moreover, this percentage was still increasing year by year. In other words, as long as they were hard-working people, dutiful people, and people who were willing to work hard, they would be able to live a prosperous life. This was something that he didn't even dare to think about before. Now, someone had actually realized it and even let him see it. This had greatly affected him. How he wished that the common people of his country could also live such a life. That way, even if he died immediately, it would be worth it. But in his heart, he knew very well that this was impossible. Not to mention other things, just the privileges of the rich and powerful were something that no one could abolish. If someone really did this, they would be overthrown by the rich and powerful. Even if he and the king worked together, they would not be able to do it. Even so, a bold idea appeared in his mind. If he could not do it, he might as well give it to someone else, such as the leader of Yang Xia, Yang Chendong. After having this idea, Apu quickly shook his head, wanting to suppress it. Wasn't this the same as selling out his country? Wasn't this the same as giving his country to someone else? This was the act of a traitor. Apu wanted to suppress this sudden thought, but after it appeared, he discovered that it wasn't something he could suppress even if he wanted to. This was especially so when he visited other provinces under Yang Xie. He saw many common people who had migrated from other places and lived with them. When he asked them whether they still remembered where they were from, whether they wanted to return to their homeland, or whether they wanted to rebuild their country, the answers he received were the same. Of course I want to go home. After all, it's my homeland. But if I have to live a life where I can't eat or wear clothes, I'd rather stay here. Here, my family and I lived a good life. We didn't have to worry about our next meal, nor did we have to worry about our wealth being swallowed by the rich and powerful. We also didn't have to worry about our own safety and whether or not enemies would suddenly attack. This is the life I want. As for the past, forget about it. Just treat it as a memory. That's right, it's a painful memory. When this answer did not come from one person, but from 10 people, at least 9.5 gave the same answer. Apu knew that the common people's eyes were clear, and Yang Qindong's actions were correct. If it was wrong, why would the common people speak up for him? Why would he receive the support of the common people? Why would the common people be truly satisfied to the point where they would forget their homeland and their country? After slowly going from not understanding to understanding, Apu began to believe in his thoughts. Yang Qindong was correct, and this method could also be applied to his country. Although the price he had to pay was the loss of his royal authority, compared to the common people being able to live a better life, it was all worth it. Back then, wasn't his wish to let the common people live a better life. For this, he swore that he would sacrifice everything, including himself. Since there was such an opportunity, what was he waiting for? 4 years later, Apu finally thought it through and sent a telegram to Yang Qindong. He explained his views and thoughts and was willing to pay any price. He wanted to do something for this matter. Yang Qindong was naturally very happy that Apu was able to think this through. This was also one of the important reasons why he wanted to capture Apu. He immediately arranged for people to escort Apu to the eastern front lines, preparing to return. After receiving the order, the commander of the foreign army, Bai Shuang, received the order and Apu appeared in front of Wu Liji. When he entered the city, even though Apu was in a carriage, he could still see the current situation of the common people through the window. Compared to 4 years ago, the common people here were even more bitter. They were all thin and sallow, and some could even be blown away by a gust of wind. Their eyes were empty and lifeless, as if they were walking corpses. They had no aspirations, no dreams, and no expectations for tomorrow. Compared to the common people of Yangxia, they were all full of energy, and their bodies were broad and strong. They were like people from 2 different worlds. This also strengthened Apu's thoughts. He also hoped that the common people here could enjoy the same treatment as the common people of the other provinces of Yangxia. That's right, in Yang Qindong's words, it was called liberation. It was liberation. It had to be liberation. With this firm thought, Apu met Wu Liji and saw the other party's enthusiasm. Speaking of which, for Wu Liji to have his current status, it was naturally because of King Baride's approval, but it was more because of Apu's recommendation and promotion. In a sense, he was the one who recognized Wu Liji. It was for this reason that the first person Apu chose to meet was Wu Liji. He firmly believed that even if Wu Liji didn't agree with his point of view, he wouldn't betray him. Seeing Wu Liji's excited expression, Apu reached out and patted him on the shoulder. "General Wu Liji, is there a safe place? I have something to say to you in private." "HM? Oh, there is. Please come with me." Wu Liji's expression instantly became much more solemn. He already had a vague feeling in his heart. The two soon appeared in a secret room in the residence. Without permission, no one was allowed to approach this place. Otherwise, Wu Liji's personal guards would kill them for threatening the general's safety. In the quiet secret room, the two sat facing each other. After Wu Liji poured a cup of tea, Apu slowly opened his mouth and gave a general account of his 4 years of disappearance. Wu Liji listened attentively. He was very curious about the 5-star army. He also wanted to see what kind of power could cultivate such a powerful cavalry. Could it be that the Han people were so powerful that they were invincible? Were they so powerful that they changed their strategy? All of this was explained by Apu's words. It turned out that the relationship between Wu Nanwang of the Great Ming Dynasty and the Great Ming Dynasty was not subordinate to each other. Instead, he belonged to an emerging force. No wonder this was the case. In a sense, Yang Qindong was equivalent to a founding monarch. He belonged to a new power that was constantly developing and expanding based on the Great Ming's borders. In Yang Xie's power, there were no so-called nobles, and there were no restraints. Once they wanted to do something, they could wholeheartedly devote themselves to it and didn't need to think too much. Just this alone was something that the other old powers couldn't compare to. Just the existence of nobles and nobles had dragged down countless people who wanted to rise but couldn't. To make a simple analogy, power and wealth were not concentrated. Most of the land was in the hands of a few influential people, and the lives of the common people were miserable. In such an environment, no matter how good one's ideas were, it would be very difficult to turn them into reality. Chapter 15:12. The 5-star army didn't have such concerns right now, but no one could guarantee that they wouldn't in the future. Wu Liji also raised his doubts on this issue. Sir Prime Minister, can this King Wunan of Damiang really eliminate the existence of influential officials? If this is the case, who can guarantee that his position will be stable? Without the support of influential officials, how long can his country last? Does he really have to rely on the common people? What a joke. The common people don't have their own consciousness. Once chaos breaks out, they won't be able to make their own decisions. All they can do is follow the script. Facing Wu Liji's impolite criticism, Alip didn't argue with him. In his opinion, whether or not Yang Qindong really could eliminate the existence of influential officials wasn't important. What was important was that he had already accomplished this. What was important was that the current King Wunan of Damiang was his enemy. What was important was that this King Wunan of Damiang had never shown mercy to his enemies. In this person's eyes, there were only 2 choices: surrender or be exterminated. There was no such thing as a sovereign state or an auxiliary state. General Wu Liji, if you wish to discuss this matter, there will be plenty of opportunities in the future. Let's talk about the current situation first. Right now, the 5-star army's 2 armies are about to converge. Moreover, we are doing our best to stop Li Zheng here. Do you think we can stop this great momentum? Facing Alip's sharp question, Wu Liji didn't avoid it. Instead, after thinking for a bit, he replied, "This time, we might be able to stop them. However, the next time might not be the case. If the 5-star army is determined to achieve their goal, I believe we won't be able to stop them in the end." Good. Alip nodded in satisfaction. He originally thought that Wu Liji would refuse to admit it out of pride and face. Now that he had admitted to this point, the following words were easy to say. Yes, General Wu Liji's vision is indeed far. Even our so-called Khaganate alliance won't be able to stop the 5-star army's cavalry. Without sufficient financial support, without sufficient rear, food, and reserves, our strength will only grow weaker and weaker. In the end, we will lose everything and be defeated here. In comparison, the 5-star army has an enviable rear. No matter if it is food, military equipment, or soldiers, as long as they want, they can continuously supply us. Even if they eventually exhaust us, they can still exhaust us to death. Since that is the case, why do we have to wait until we can't hold on anymore? Why can't we make a decision earlier? This way, we can sacrifice fewer warriors and commoners. This is a good thing to accumulate merit. Even if we take 10,000 steps back, even if we win this battle, what can we get? The Wunan of the Kaganates of Damyang's territory. There was a person in front of him, with his back facing the king, who seemed to be saying something to him. The 2 guards shouted as soon as they entered the room, "His Majesty the King has arrived." Hearing her voice, Wu Liji forced himself to sit up. With his back facing her, he slowly began to turn around. At this moment, Bao Lide's gaze was completely focused on Wu Liji. He didn't notice the person who was halfway through turning around. With a concerned expression, he asked softly, "General Wu Liji, what's wrong with your body? It's only been a few days. How did you get so sick?" Just as he said that, Bao Lide's gaze met the eyes of the figure who had turned around. When he saw who it was, he froze on the spot, as if he had seen a ghost. He didn't know what to do. Not only was King Baoli stunned, but the 2 guards he brought with him were also rooted to the spot with a look of shock on their faces. This was because they recognized who it was. Who else could it be other than the Prime Minister? Apal? "Prime, Your Majesty the King, it's been 4 years. Have you been well?" Apal was naturally much calmer. It was obvious that he had expected this scene. At the same time, 4 bodyguards rushed out from the corner of the room. While the 2 palace guards were still in a daze, they instantly pinned them to the ground. The commotion behind him caught the attention of King Baoli. He turned around and saw his guard being restrained. His face turned pale with fright. He turned around and looked at Apuli. Then, as if he had realized something, he asked, "Minister, what are you trying to do?" "Your Majesty the King, there's no need to panic. We have no intention of harming you. In fact, we're here to help you," Apal said calmly. He pointed at a chair beside him as if to say, "Let's sit down and talk." Seeing Apu's calm expression, King Boride sighed and sat down. Since he was here, he should take things as they came. He understood his prime minister too well. Since he had appeared, he must have made preparations. If he did not cooperate and insisted on shouting, it would only force the other party to do something unfavorable to him. King Boride sat down on his chair. From Apu's eyes, he knew that he was halfway done, just like how the other party understood him. He also understood the king very well. This was an ambitious king who could judge the situation and size up the situation. He was not an impulsive person. He knew what could be done, what could not be done, and even what should be done at the right time. "Please allow me to address you as Your Majesty." "Your Majesty, the current situation is like this." As Apu continued to explain, the situation of the entire Khanate alliance became clearer to King Baolid. Akhmo City, the capital of the Kazakh Empire. More and more Mongolian cavalry appeared 30 li away from the city. They were like the dark clouds in the sky before a heavy downpour, appearing in groups on this land. The scouts gathered all the information they saw and presented it to Commander Tian, who, one by one, small black flags were inserted into the military sand table that had been prepared long ago. "Sir, the enemy is coming at us aggressively. Why don't we take the initiative to attack?" 1st Division Commander Tae Mu stood in front of the sand table and suggested, 5th Division Commander, what do you think?" Tian, who didn't reply. Instead, he looked at Division Commander Gong Feng, who was deep in thought. "Sir, I think we should hold our ground. If we leave the city now, it will be much safer. However, It will also mean that we have opened up a path to the Ili region. Once the Mongolian army is free, they will be able to attack the 2nd and 3rd divisions. If that happens, they will be in a precarious situation. Gong Feng shook his head. His opinion was different from division commander Te Mu Er's. Chapter 15:13. This time, without waiting for Tianhu to ask, Temu asked anxiously, "Defend? How? We only have about 20,000 men, but the enemy has 80,000. This doesn't even include the allied armies from other kaganates. Besides, our world's #1 cavalry army focuses on offense. Defense isn't our forte." Temu's words made sense. The world's #1 cavalry army was second only to the Black Cavalry in terms of cold weapons. No matter what kind of powerful enemy they faced, once they became their target, they would not have a good ending. This was a publicly acknowledged fact. However, when it came to defense, they were a little lacking. After all, cavalry focused on offense while infantry focused on defense. This had become a law in many people's hearts and an objective fact. No, Commander Temu is wrong. We don't only have about 20,000 men. We also have 6,000 captives and 100,000 Kazakh civilians. They can all be used by us. When Gong Feng said this, there was a smile on his face. It was obvious that he already had a card up his sleeve. Looking at Gong Feng's confident expression, Commander Tian, who chuckled, "Oh, it seems like our 5th commander has a card up his sleeve. Since that's the case, the task of defending the city will be handed over to your 5th commander. If there's anything you need, we will do our best to cooperate." With Tianhu's words, Gong Feng felt more confident. "Thank you for your support, Commander. Since that's the case, this subordinate will try his best." Gong Feng's so-called try was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had already prepared for it. He had carefully studied some of the beautiful battles under Yang Qindong's command and learned many things. One of them was how to use money to buy people's hearts for his own use. Harsenhan had left in a hurry. He had never thought that the 5-star army would suddenly appear in front of his capital. Without any preparation, he had left, but the wealth he had accumulated over the years was left in Akmo City. Now, this wealth was in the hands of the 5-star army. With these riches as capital, Gong Feng piled them up in the largest open space in the city. As more and more Mongolian citizens were attracted by these things, various rewards were placed in front of them where they could earn riches if they contributed to the war. Using Gong Feng's explanation, it was natural for soldiers to be paid. As long as the commoners were willing to help the 5-star army defend the city, then the wealth would belong to them. In order to make everyone believe in his sincerity, everyone who came to watch the fun was rewarded. Some were given silver, some were given copper coins, and some were given refined salt, ironware, and precious furs, tea leaves, and silk. Just by coming to watch the show, they were able to obtain so many benefits. When the local things fell into their hands, more and more citizens began to believe in the 5-star army. As the saying goes, facts speak louder than words. With the things in hand, this was the real thing. It was far more effective than 10 or 100 sentences. With the cooperation of the surrendered Mongolian soldiers that Gong Feng had bribed beforehand, the first batch of people stepped forward and expressed their willingness to work for the 5-star army. When they expressed their desire to distribute the wealth to themselves, Gong Feng waved his hand and took out some good things in front of everyone. Things became much easier after that. Soon, there was a second batch of people, a third batch, and a fourth batch. 10 miles outside Akmo City, General Harbala, who had come under the orders of the Timur Empire's great General Mandarat, stopped and began to set up camp with his 80,000 men. This time, he had come under the orders of the great general to deal with the 5-star army's cavalry. Harbala still had some chance of winning. He had already received accurate information that there were only 20,000 enemies guarding Akamo City. Moreover, Akamo City could not be considered a city at all. It was just a large market surrounded by earthen walls. Without the support of the city walls, Halbera was confident that the Penistar Legion would not be his match. He was even prepared for the possibility that the enemy would flee the moment they caught wind of the news. If that happened, he wouldn't attack. Instead, he would continue east and cut off the 20,000 five-star army's advance. He would eliminate all potential threats. With his own thoughts and plans, Harbara took the initiative to stop when he was 10 miles away from Akamo. He wanted to create momentum and achieve his goal of defeating the enemy without fighting. However, the development of the situation didn't seem to go according to his plan. Facing the arrival of his army, the five-star army didn't seem to have any intention of retreating. Instead, scouts reported that the enemy was reinforcing the city walls. There were even trenches outside the city that stretched for 5 miles. How dare they? Harbala was furious when he heard the news. Sheep should flee when they see a wolf. This was a law that had never changed. But now, someone wanted to violate this law. How could he tolerate it? Send people to fill in the trenches. We must pave a smooth path for the army to advance. At the same time, urge the other reinforcements to move faster. This time, this general will eat up these arrogant five-star army. I want them to know the consequences of provoking us. I want them to kneel at my feet and beg for mercy. Ha ha ha. Harbala was determined to eat up the five-star army in front of him. In the city, Division Commander Gongfeng wasn't idle either. He was still organizing people to dig the trenches. Under the direct stimulation of wealth, the hundreds of thousands of people in the city who had the strength to do so were mobilized. If the Khanate army had hot air balloons, they would have seen the bustling scene in the city. 10 days passed in the blink of an eye, under Harbala's constant urging. Not only were the trenches 5 miles outside the city filled up, the first reinforcements of the Khanate army, the 20,000 cavalry of the Khanate of Kazan, also arrived outside Akmo under the leadership of General Hafertel. With 100,000 soldiers and no more obstacles in front of him, Harbala was very pleased with himself. He ordered a good night's rest. The next morning, they would attack the city. In one night, for his own safety and to prevent the five-star army from breaking out, Harbala arranged for 30,000 cavalry to set up an ambush and set up a trap. However, it was a pity that the five-star army did not make the slightest movement until daybreak. Ha ha, General, the five-star army must be afraid. Hafertel looked up to the sky and laughed. At the same time, he looked down on Harbala's cautiousness. In his opinion, a two-legged sheep would always be a two-legged sheep. When had you ever seen a sheep that could eat a wolf? Knowing that he was being laughed at, Harbala ignored Hafertel and ordered his 10,000 cavalry to charge. He wanted to take the first merit and prove that the cavalry of the Timur Empire was the strongest. The wall was only 10 feet tall, but under the impact of the huge logs, a huge crack quickly appeared. Then, a gap of 20 to 30 feet appeared, allowing the cavalry to charge through. War drums sounded, and the 10,000 Timur cavalry charged in high spirits. But when the cavalry entered the earth wall, they were surprised to find that not a single one of the five-star army cavalry could be seen. Just as many of the cavalrymen were confused and didn't understand what was going on, cries of agony rang out one after another. Many of the cavalrymen who were eager to contribute fell into the deep pits while charging and were stabbed to death by the sharpened logs that had been set up in the pits. They were severely injured. It won't work here. Try from another direction. The captain leading the cavalry roared and ordered the cavalry to change the direction of attack. But without exception, The path forward was filled with deep trenches. In other words, after the trenches on the outside, there were also countless trenches in the city. No one knew how long these trenches were. Acmo City was very poor. It didn't have any proper city defenses, and there weren't many houses that were pleasing to the eye. But it had one advantage, and that was that it was large enough and long enough. Perhaps this had something to do with the fact that the Khans liked to fight for territory. Whenever they arrived at a new place, they would always try to carve out as much territory as possible for them to use. As the capital of the Kazakh Empire, Akimo City was naturally not small. This allowed Commander Gongfeng to have enough space to trade for time. Hearing the cries of the injured soldiers and seeing the countless trenches and trenches, the captain leading the cavalry retreated from the city with a headache and reported what he saw to Harbala. There's such a thing. The result was completely different from what he had imagined. At this moment, Harbala felt as if his heart was being scratched. The feeling of knowing that the enemy was right in front of him, but he couldn't see or hit them, made him feel very uncomfortable. Continue to fill the trenches. This general doesn't believe that the 20,000 five-star army can be stronger than our 100,000 soldiers. Harbala had no choice but to use the stupidest method, which was to continue to fill the trenches. He didn't think that the five-star army could make the 100,000 Kazakh civilians in the city work for them. In his mind, his own people were the most unyielding and wouldn't be used by the Hans. Just like that, the 100,000 cavalry dismounted and put down their sabers, becoming engineers and starting to fill the trenches. Meanwhile, the 100,000 Kazakh civilians in the city continued to dig the trenches. One dug and one filled, as if they were in some kind of competition. The original cavalry charge had become a competition, completely going against the original intention of the war. It also bought a lot of time for the 20,000 cavalry of the world's first cavalry army. Chapter 1514. The digging competition was still going on, and when Harbala put all the cavalry into it, the progress was noticeably faster. On the 13th day, they could finally see the figures digging in the distance. This gave the cavalry of the Khanate a glimmer of hope, and they became even more motivated to work. But at the same time, what made them depressed was that when the distance between the two sides could be seen clearly with their eyes, they discovered that the ones digging the tunnel were not the five-star army, but seemed to be some Kazakh civilians wearing clothes similar to theirs. This discovery made Harbala very angry. How could his own people be controlled by the Han people? This is a kind of blasphemy. Seeing Harbala so angry, the general of the Khanate came up with an idea, a stupid move. "General, why don't we shout to the people on the other side? Presumably they were forced by the five-star army. As long as we promise to surrender to them, we can forgive their crimes. On the contrary, if they continue to help the Han people, we will kill them without mercy. I think they will make the right choice, and in this way, they will not be used by the enemy." "Oh, good idea, good idea, good idea. Ha, come, go and shout according to General Harbala's idea. Remember, when you threaten them, use a more ruthless tone. These people are afraid of death. They will definitely not be used by the five-star army." Whether it was in Harbala's eyes or in Harbala's eyes, the people were the most afraid of threats. As long as enough pressure was applied, they will definitely yield. And without the obstruction of the trenches, the more than 20,000 five-star army in front of them were like a group of sheep waiting to be slaughtered, and they could do whatever they wanted to them. It must be said that the two generals may be good at leading troops, but when it comes to understanding people's hearts, they are too far behind. At least compared to Gongfeng, they are not at the same level. On one side were 100,000 old and weak people, and on the other side were 100,000 strong cavalry in the prime of their lives. Their ability to work naturally could not be mentioned in the same breath. This is the reason why, even though the Khanate's army moved later, their progress was still able to catch up. If this continues, it will only be a matter of time before the two sides fight. But Harbala's wrong move was destined to help the five-star army. After the local shouts came from afar, the originally tired Kazakh people were suddenly filled with energy, and their digging speed was even faster than before. Before, there was no threat. Everyone was just helping out for the sake of money. But now, after the threatening words of the Khaganate Alliance army reached their ears, the people realized that they had no other choice. Or rather, their fates were completely tied together with the five-star army, surrendering in the past. Not to mention whether the five-star army would agree or not with the greedy character of the Khanate's army. If they surrendered, the Khanate's army would take all the good things. How many people would be willing to vent their anger on something that was already in their hands? And if the five-star army, then the army of the five-star army. This was the Kazakh people's people. They were bound together for good or ill. If it was said that before they worked hard to dig holes to earn more money so that they could have a better life, then now they were digging holes for their own safety. At this time, even if Gongfeng didn't give them any benefits, these people would still do their best. Gongfeng also saw this, but he didn't stop giving them benefits. Using the words of his teacher, Yang Chendong, any problem that could be solved with money was not a problem. Not only did their shouts fail, but the other side's speed also began to increase. In contrast, the 100,000 cavalry that had been working for dozens of days and nights began to show signs of fatigue. They were cavalry, not laborers. Their battlefield was to kill enemies, not to dig holes. After a long time, some of the soldiers began to complain. The army's morale was shaken, and Harbala's face didn't look good for a day. However, just when he had nowhere to vent his anger, another piece of news came from the front that made him even more angry. One of the Khanate's army, the Ili Brigade, actually surrendered to the five-star army. The Ili Brigade was the first to become enemies with the five-star army. At that time, the Khanate's army and the five-star army weren't enemies. At least, they didn't interfere with each other's business. It was because of the Ili Brigade's request for help that the entire Khanate's army was pulled in. Okay, right now, all the large and small Khanates were fighting with all their might against the five-star army. While they were fighting for the right to rule this area, the instigator, Ilahani, had actually chosen to surrender first, abandoning everyone. How could this not make people angry when they heard this? Especially the Khanates that were prepared to divide the Ili Brigade. Not only did they not get to eat the meat in their hands, they also attracted the wolf. It was really like trying to steal a chicken only to end up losing the rice used to lure it. It made people want to cry, but no tears came out. Of course, as a general in charge of the army, Harbala didn't have to think too much about it. He was thinking about how to deal with the more than 20,000 five-star army. Because the news said that after the Ili Brigade's army suddenly surrendered, the five-star army's main force on the Eastern Front didn't have any obstacles on their way. At this time, they were speeding toward the Kazakh Khanate. Although the news didn't say how many people the five-star army sent, the word main force was enough to make people vigilant. In other words, once the main force arrived, Harbala was afraid that he wouldn't be able to win. And if he couldn't deal with the five-star army before the main force arrived, he was afraid that he wouldn't have a chance to make a move. The situation became serious. If Harbala wasn't in a hurry before, he could still waste time with the other side. But now, time had become very important for him. He had no choice but to call the commander of the Kazan Khanate, General Hafertel, to discuss how to speed up the battle with the main force of the five-star army as soon as possible. Hafertel, who also received the news, also felt the seriousness of the situation. He didn't dare to watch from the sidelines. All 20,000 cavalry under his command threw themselves into the work of filling the hole, striving to fight with the five-star army in the shortest time possible. Tian, who was surrounded, learned about the surrender of the Ili Brigade through a telegram. When Tian, who heard the news, he called Tai Mu, and Gong Feng, two division commanders, to share the joy with them. Amazing teacher is amazing. He actually instigated the rebellion of the Ili Brigade. In this way, the initiative is in our hands. Division Commander Gong Feng, who rushed back from the front line after hearing the news, sighed and admired. Of course, teacher is naturally the most amazing. Since the situation has changed like this, and we are not far away from the arrival of reinforcements, let's discuss how to counterattack. To be honest, the soldiers have all fattened up after staying in the city for more than a month. It's time for them to exercise their limbs. Tian, who chuckled and looked at division commanders Tai Mu, and Gong Feng. I agree. General, leave the vanguard mission to our division. You also know that we haven't done anything during this period of time, waiting for the time to counterattack. Tai Mu opened his mouth and asked for battle. Tian, who didn't immediately agree after hearing this. Instead, he looked at Gong Feng, wanting to see what he had to say. Facing this kind of questioning gaze, Gong Feng nodded and said, I think it's time to counterattack. To be honest, for more than a month, we have taken large strides and given up a large area. Now that we have nowhere to retreat to, it's only a matter of time before we counterattack. No matter what, Division Commander Gong has worked hard. Good. Since that's what you mean, then let's discuss how to counterattack. Come, tell me, when do you think it's appropriate to launch a counterattack? Tian, who laughed. He had also had enough of this situation where they were constantly retreating. If it wasn't for the fact that he had been ordered to stay here like a nail, he wouldn't have taken the 100,000 enemy cavalry seriously. Throughout the history of the world's #1 cavalry army, there were countless examples of them winning battles with fewer troops. He had long been accustomed to boasting. The five-star army was preparing for a counterattack. Halba was completely unaware of this. He was still constantly urging the soldiers to speed up the filling of the holes. For this reason, the soldiers had even changed from 4 shifts a day to 2 shifts, increasing the manpower. As a result, they were able to speed up the filling of the holes. However, the soldiers didn't get enough rest and were generally not in good spirits. At this moment, Halba didn't care so much. Perhaps in his opinion, even if the soldiers didn't have enough energy, but with 100,000 against 20,000, he was still confident of victory. Another night had arrived. It started to drizzle, making the filling of the holes more difficult. Even so, Halba didn't intend to let the soldiers rest. Seeing that he was less than 4 kilometers away from the five-star army, he could already see them from afar. He didn't want to delay their progress because of the rain. Out of the 100,000 cavalrymen, there were 50,000 of them working in 2 shifts to fill up the holes. Under the heavy rain, their feet were walking on the muddy ground, and they were very tired. After a night, the sky started to clear up. Halba came to the front line and saw that the distance between the 2 sides had decreased from 4 miles to 2 miles. His eyes were filled with satisfaction. Very good, continue. In 3 days, we can launch the attack. Looking at the Kazakh civilians 2 li away, Harbala swore in his heart that when he defeated the five-star army, he would not leave a single one of them alive. He would kill them all. He wanted to use this opportunity to tell everyone what the consequences of going against the Khanate army were. Chapter 15:15. While Harbala was still dreaming, the soldiers of the Khaganate army, who had been busy the whole day, changed shifts. The exhausted Mongolian cavalry returned to their tents to rest. Another 50,000 men entered the battlefield to fill in the holes and pave the way. Tired from the day's work, the soldiers only ate a little when they entered the tent and went to sleep. To them, the temptation of food was not as attractive as the bed. What they did not know was that, for many, this sleep meant that they would never be able to open their eyes again. At night, there was a gentle breeze that felt very cool on the body. A division of 10,000 cavalry mounted their horses in the cool breeze. They checked their equipment and prepared to attack at any time. Tonight was the night that Tian, Hu, and the other two had discussed the counterattack. No one knew that the Kazakh civilians who looked like they were working hard to dig the deep holes during the day were actually just kicking up dust. The reason for doing this was to confuse the Khanate coalition army. In fact, the land wasn't destroyed, so the cavalry could move unimpeded at any time. How is it? Has the enemy not filled in the holes yet? Commander Taimur rode on his horse. There was excitement and anxiety on his face. At the same time, there was a look of disdain for the enemy. It should be soon. However, once the enemy discovers that the path is cleared, they will react quickly without the deep holes. That is why Commander Taimur must hurry. At this time, Tian, who was also riding on a war horse. Behind him were thousands of soldiers directly under his command. They would be the second wave of attack to attack the enemy. Rest assured, Commander, this subordinate understands. Taimur nodded. His eyes were bright as he looked forward. He was only waiting for Commander Gongfeng's signal to attack. At this moment, Gongfeng was holding a telescope and lying behind a mound of dirt. He was only about 60 steps away from the nearest enemy. At this moment, if he was discovered, the enemy would only need a wave of arrows to take his life. But even so, it still did not stop Gongfeng from risking his life to take the risk. He needed to have first-hand information. Once he discovered that the enemy had filled in all the deep holes, he needed to immediately send the signal to attack. This rhythm had to be grasped well. If they were late, the enemy would be on guard. If they wanted to sneak into the enemy's camp and cause serious damage, it would be impossible. Holding the night vision binoculars, Gongfeng carefully observed the other party's movements. Gongfeng didn't know how long he had been staring at them until there was some commotion in the other side's camp. He also saw some people turn around and run back. From the looks of it, it was obvious that they were going to report the news. Gongfeng knew that the road must have been cleared. Send the signal. Ask the first division to attack immediately, quick. Gongfeng hurriedly shouted to the radio operator beside him. The messenger, who received the order, quickly lit the torch in his hand and waved it around. 3 miles behind, Commander Tian, who was overjoyed when he saw the flashing flames. The path is clear. We can attack now. Understood. Taimur replied excitedly. Then, with a loud shout, the 10,000 five-star army soldiers pulled out their sabers. Shouting loudly, they urged their war horses to charge forward. Throw away the torches, retreat quickly. The torches here had also attracted the attention of the Khaganate Alliance army dozens of steps away. Gongfeng grabbed the radio operator's arm and ordered him to throw away the torch. Then he pulled him and ran quickly to the rear. Not long after Gongfeng ran away, a series of arrows landed near the place where he was originally at, near the torch that had not been completely extinguished. The ground was covered in arrows. But then these arrows were trampled to the ground by the charging war horses of a division. After Taimur's cavalry charged forward for 3 miles, they finally arrived in front of the panicking Khaganate Alliance army and began a bloody massacre. Caught off guard, the tens of thousands of Khaganate Alliance army soldiers became lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Facing an uncountable number of cavalrymen of the five-star army, What they had in their hands were only iron tools used to fill the ground. These could not even be considered as decent weapons. Furthermore, they were infantry. How could they possibly fight against the well-prepared five-star army? Run! No one knew who shouted first, but it became an order for the soldiers to retreat. In the dark night, countless black dots began to rapidly retreat. In order to run faster, many people threw the iron tools in their hands to the ground to reduce the burden on their bodies. Charge straight through, don't worry about these people. Commander Temu rode on his horse. When he saw many soldiers stop and swing their sabers at the unarmed and panicked Khaganate Alliance army soldiers, he couldn't help but shout loudly. Since they were the vanguard, they naturally had to break through the enemy's camp and kill their courage. It wasn't their responsibility to kill the defeated army. The commander gave the order. The highly disciplined soldiers of the world's first cavalry army quickly adjusted their direction. In groups of a few dozen, they formed an arrow formation and pierced into the Khaganate Alliance army's camp like sharp blades. In the chaos of the night, the Khaganate Alliance army soldiers could not tell how many Khaganate Alliance army soldiers had arrived. Fear engulfed the 50,000 soldiers as they frantically retreated. During this time, countless people trampled on each other. Whenever someone fell to the ground in the process of escaping, even if they were not trampled to death by their comrades, they would be trampled to death by the horses of the world's first cavalry army. The battle had been one-sided from the start. 10,000 cavalry chased after 50,000 infantry and continuously slashed at each other. It was like a monstrous flood that poured into the Khaganate Alliance army's camp. Harbala was woken up from his sleep. When he learned that the five-star army had launched an attack, his face was filled with disbelief. This is impossible. Didn't they not open up the path? There are so many deep pits. How did their cavalry charge through? General, we have been deceived. The five-star army did not dig the pits at all. They were just putting on an act. When we filled up all the pits at night, they launched their counterattack. We are completely unprepared, and the army has suffered heavy losses. The captain who came to report was covered in sweat as he spoke anxiously. What? Cunning five-star army? Cunning Han? Harbala couldn't help but roar when he heard this. After shouting a few times to vent his dissatisfaction, Harbala shouted again. What are you still standing here for? Quickly gather the troops and prepare to counterattack. As the cavalry of the Timur Empire, although the situation was sudden, when the general gave the order, many soldiers still ran out of their tents. They picked up their bows and prepared to defend. Just as these Khaganate Alliance army soldiers rushed out, and before they could complete their formation, countless black figures appeared in front of them. The ones at the front were the 50,000 Khaganate Alliance army soldiers. It's our own people. A sharp-eyed soldier saw the identity of the incoming people and shouted, "Release the arrows!" Harbala, who had already put on his armor, came to the front of the camp. When he saw the black figures entering the range of the arrows, he didn't hesitate to shout. However, the order was given, but not many people carried it out. It was obvious that they couldn't bear to point their arrows at their own comrades. What are you waiting for? Don't you know that these are already defeated soldiers? If we ignore them and let them come, we won't have any defense left. Release the arrows immediately. Harbala shouted with all his might. He didn't forget to add, those who don't release the arrows will be disobeying orders. Execute. When the word execute fell, the hesitant Khaganate Alliance army soldiers no longer dared to hesitate and released the arrows they had prepared beforehand. The arrows landed on the black figures rushing towards them. For a moment, screams of pain sounded one after another. General Hafertel was among the defeated soldiers. His luck wasn't too good. He was the one leading the troops to fill up the trenches tonight. But as a general, he didn't need to do anything. Under the protection of some soldiers, he set up a tent and went to rest when the sky turned dark. He didn't sleep for long before a sudden tremor woke him up. At the same time, he knew that something bad was going to happen. He immediately retreated with the defeated soldiers. All he wanted to do was to regroup with the main force and then block the charge of the 5-star Army cavalry. As long as they were able to stop the enemy's momentum, they would be able to counterattack and turn defeat into victory under the condition that the path was cleared. After running all the way, Hafertel was a bit out of breath. Finally, the main camp was right in front of him. Just when he was about to win, the enemy suddenly released a row of arrows. The soldiers in front of him were shot down by their own arrows. This scene made him want to curse out loud. He wanted to curse his comrades for not having eyes. But at this time, he heard Harbala's shout. He finally understood that this general wanted to kill them in order to protect himself. Behind him was the 5-star Army's cavalry that was closing in on him. And in front of him were his own allies who were ready with their bows and arrows. At this moment, Hafertel was caught in a dilemma. If he wanted to fight against the 5-star Army behind him, he didn't have any weapons in his hands. In addition, he was in a disadvantageous position against the cavalry. The consequences were obvious. Since that was the case, he might as well continue to charge forward. As long as he could reach his own camp, pick up his weapon and mount his horse, he would have the strength to fight again. Brothers, we are allies. We are on the same side. Please let us pass. We will fight side by side with you. After thinking it through, Hafertel took the lead and shouted loudly. After his voice reached the camp, the other soldiers also followed suit and shouted. Chapter 15:16. The arrows couldn't stop the infantrymen. On the contrary, the cries for mercy were transmitted into the army. This infuriated Herba greatly. What do you mean by letting you come over and fighting side by side? I'm afraid that once you come over, our formation will become even more chaotic. The 5-star Army will take the opportunity to charge in. If that happens, there's no need to talk about resistance. We'll all die here. Thinking of the serious consequences, Herba's face turned fierce. Don't let them come over. Let them go back and face the 5-star Army. Tell them that we will remember their bravery. Herba's shout was heard by more and more soldiers. When it reached the ears of Herba's group, they almost died from anger. Facing the 5-star Army, this bravery will be remembered. But what use is that? Without weapons or horses, how can they be a match for the elite Han cavalry? This is clearly an act of suicide. As for being remembered for their bravery, what use is that? Not many of them will be able to leave this place alive. Who will repay this favor? This is simply forcing us to die. The anger in Herba's heart was completely ignited by these words. If we're going to die anyway, why not drag Herba down with us? That way, we won't be lonely on the road to the Yellow Springs. With that thought in mind, Hafertel shouted again, Brothers, if we don't move, we'll die. Since our comrades despise us, let's fight it out with them and let them know how serious the consequences of abandoning their comrades are. Fight it out. Let's drag them down with us. The abandoned soldiers shouted with tears on their faces. It was a matter of course for the enemy to kill them, but for their allies to do this to them was too heartbreaking. Since the enemy didn't care about their comrades, why should they care? Thus, Hafiter led his men and charged forward with a furious look on his face. Behind them, Division Commander Tae Mu saw the changes on the battlefield very clearly. He had no intention of interfering. This was a scene he was happy to see. As long as the Khanate soldiers didn't turn around and attack him, he wouldn't force them too much. The actions of the five-star army behind them gave great encouragement to Hafit, Big Mo, and the others. It was as if they had found someone to rely on. Their attacks became even more ferocious, to the extent that the vanguard of both sides soon clashed together. At such a close distance, the effect of arrows was very limited. Finally, Herba and the others who didn't have to passively take a beating began to counterattack. Some of them even stole the enemy's weapons, causing great losses and threats to Herba's army. "Shoot, no need to be polite, kill them all." Harbara's eyes flashed with anger. Seeing that the 10,000 men at the front were about to be breached, he hurriedly ordered the other Khanate soldiers to fire arrows from afar. At this moment, he didn't care about who was on his side or who was his opponent. In his eyes, anyone who stood opposite him was his enemy. "It's time to charge. All soldiers of the 1st Division, listen up. Charge. Let's show them the power of our first army." Taimur watched as the arrows rained down. Hundreds and thousands of Khanate soldiers died in front of him. The pace of the attack was slowed, so he didn't wait any longer. After giving the order, a total of 5 regiments, 10,000 cavalrymen, rode on their horses and launched a fierce charge. Cavalrymen's charge was different from that of infantry. They were faster, stronger, and more ferocious. After the 10,000 cavalrymen launched a series of attacks, the entire earth began to tremble violently. This powerful movement caused the anti-Khanate soldiers to involuntarily retreat to the sides, especially after a division of soldiers shouted that those who surrender and kneel on the ground could live. One after another, the anti-Khanate soldiers obediently knelt on the ground. This action not only caused Hafertel's soldiers to kneel, but also many of Harbala's soldiers who were standing at the front to kneel down. This seemed to have become a chain reaction, providing an even more advantageous condition for the cavalry to charge. The horses galloped past. As expected, the kneeling Khanate soldiers weren't harmed in the slightest. On the other hand, those who were still standing, those who genuinely wanted to resist, or those who hadn't yet reacted, were killed by the cavalry. As the cavalry charged forward, one figure after another was slashed to death in the darkness. Lines of defense began to crumble one after another. The soldiers could not stop their footsteps from retreating. Anyone who didn't want to die wouldn't use their bodies to block the charge of the horses. "Quick, quick, where are our cavalrymen? Haven't they mounted yet?" Halbera roared anxiously when he saw several lines of defense being breached in front of him. Perhaps it was because of his shouts that the first batch of Khanate Alliance soldiers on horses finally arrived behind him. Some of them were still dressed in disheveled clothes, and there was a hint of panic on their faces. But no matter what, they still mounted their horses and held their cavalry swords in their hands. "Ha! Good. Order them to charge. We must stop the 5-star army's attack." Halba was no longer nervous and even a little fearful. Instead, he became much more high-spirited and vigorous. "The enemy cavalry is here. Take out your crossbows and shoot the enemy at close range." Commander Taimur also saw the black shadows and the sound of horse hooves in the distance. There wasn't the slightest hint of nervousness on his face as he gave the order. Oftentimes, this kind of cavalry charge was the most brutal. Often, who knew how many corpses would be left behind in a single charge? But all of this was nothing to the soldiers of the world's #1 cavalry army. Some of them were veterans who had experienced dozens of battles, big and small, and were used to seeing life and death. Even some of the rookies had experienced dozens or even dozens of battles. They were no longer rookies who panicked at the sound of horse hooves. On the contrary, these people's shouts and horse hooves could stimulate their adrenaline even more effectively, causing their blood to surge and allowing them to display their true strength. The 5 regimental commanders received the order, followed by the battalion commanders, company commanders, platoon commanders, squad leaders, and even every soldier received the order. Correspondingly, more and more small crossbows were taken off their backs and held in their hands. Then the counterattack began. At a distance of less than 40 or 50 steps, the crossbow bolts rushed forward like rain, landing in the camp of the Khanate Alliance's cavalry, causing waves of horses to fall off. In a direct confrontation, apart from the better-equipped black cavalry, even Lung Feng was no match for the world's #1 cavalry army, not to mention the Khanate Alliance's cavalry, who were in a hurry and didn't make much preparations and were physically and mentally exhausted. In just a single clash, the first group of cavalry was scattered. Soon, less than 500 of them were left. Then they turned around and fled, running towards the back. Hold on for me." Seeing that the result of the battle wasn't as evenly matched as he had imagined, and that it was a one-sided defeat, Halba shouted with a dejected face. But in this chaotic moment, such a shout wouldn't attract anyone's attention at all. It was completely drowned out by the galloping of the horses. Seeing that the second wave of cavalry was quickly defeated by the 5-star army, Halba knew that he no longer had the ability to control the 5-star army's cavalry. He had failed. Unwilling to accept this, Halba gathered up the remaining soldiers and frantically retreated under the cover of the moonlight, leaving behind the brave cavalry of the 5-star army on the battlefield. The changes on the battlefield were so fast that it was beyond everyone's expectations. When Tian, Hu, and Gong Feng arrived with the cavalry, the battle was basically over. Apart from the corpses on the battlefield, there were also captives kneeling on the ground. What's going on? Tian, who looked at all this with a frown, somewhat confused. Commander Temu rode up to Tian, who, "Commander, these soldiers of the Khaganate Alliance are too weak. We only charged, and they were defeated. Except for a few who escaped, most of them are kneeling on the ground, waiting for us to take them captives." Temu chuckled excitedly. This was the battle record of their division, and it wasn't something that others could take away. Thinking that his division alone had defeated 100,000 enemies, this was something that he could brag about. I see, could this be? Tian, who didn't dare to believe it, completely out of caution, he looked at Gong Feng. "Commander, this shouldn't be the enemy's plan. It must be that our division is too brave. It's just that the combat power of the Khaganate Alliance is too low." "Haha," Gong Feng said with a smile. In this battle, his contribution was not small. If it were not for the success of his plan, the enemy would not have been implicated, and the battle would not have been dragged out until now. Now that they had finally defeated 100,000 Khaganate Alliance soldiers, he felt that the burden on his shoulders could finally be lifted. Gong Feng had the same opinion. Tian, who nodded in agreement. "It's not that the enemy is too weak, but that we are too strong. We waited for them to tire themselves out and attacked suddenly. How could these Khaganate Alliance soldiers be a match for our 1st Sky Cavalry Army? Haha. All right, immediately send the news of victory to the 6th Young Master and wait for the next order to take these captives into custody." "Oh, right, they fled in a hurry, so they probably didn't have time to take the provisions with them. Take them all so we can have a good meal." You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.